As I drove home from work in the middle of the night, a crying woman covered in blood came running out of the forest. I saw her only milliseconds before she left the thick grove of trees on my right. Her eyes were wide and uncomprehending, her mouth open in a perpetual shriek, her clothes torn to rags. But otherwise, she was beautiful and young. I only saw the merest glimpse of a slender white leg before I instinctively turned the steering wheel all the way to the left, trying not to hit her. At the speed I was going, and with the constant rain falling down from the sky, I quickly lost control of the car. I missed her by mere inches as I swerved into the oncoming lane where, thankfully, no cars were coming. In slow motion, I saw the road pass by and then start to rise up to meet me as the car began to flip. I felt like I was in the air for minutes, but in reality, it was likely only fractions of a second. Then the car landed, the black pavement rushing up to meet me, and my vision turned to blackness. I woke up suddenly in a white room, the walls seeming to be made of high-intensity LED lights. They were so bright and white that it almost hurt to look at them. I squinted my eyes slightly, and they slowly began to adjust to the overwhelming white light surrounding me. I stood up and looked around, rising off a bed made of the same kind of light. "Where am I?" I asked. No one answered. I began to walk forward, and a building began to materialize around me suddenly, the white light all draining out of the room like water running down a drain. I was in a castle, in the entryway, looking out massive black gated doors. I looked behind me and saw the bed was just a bench with flat pillows inscribed with roses and cherubs. The castle seemed to stretch forever in a straight line, hallways with endless mahogany doors disappearing to a point in the horizon. No one moved in the rooms or hallways. Outside, birds chirped pleasantly, and a tropical, sweet-smelling breeze blew past me. I turned my attention back to the front gate, deciding to go outside. As soon as I stepped outside the shade of the castle, a blazing sun warmed me. I instinctively put my arm above my eyes to dim the summer light. As my pupils constricted and I was able to see better, I realized that the light overhead was not coming from a sun, but many eyes looking down at me from the sky. They all sent out some light of their own, brighter than a full moon, but far dimmer than the actual sun. I could look up at them and see them moving, their pupils dilating and constricting as each eye focused on something new. They stayed in constant motion, and there were thousands of them, covering the sky with white sclera, grey, purple and green irises, and constantly flicking pupils as far as my eye could see. "Those are the eyes of God," a voice behind me said. I turned and saw a beautiful woman there, holding out her hands towards me. She had green eyes that shone like emeralds, and a sweet, melodic voice that instantly calmed me. "You are in heaven. You did it, you beautiful child." She came over and put a hand on my cheek. It burned with a touch, sending waves of happiness through my body. As I looked closer, I realized she had on platinum armor and a scabbard with an obsidian sword handle sticking out of the top. Tiny diamonds and emeralds decorated both the scabbard and the handle. "This isn't like I imagined heaven to be," I said, looking at the trees all around us. They were covered in silver and gold, rising up hundreds of feet in the sky. They stood like skyscrapers, swaying slightly to and fro as the tropical breeze blew the smell of fruit and ocean through the air. At the top, I saw what looked like people moving around, flying even, but they were so high up I could barely make them out even when I squinted. "Well, the truth is," she said, her smile widening from ear to ear, showing dozens of sharpened, blood-soaked teeth, her voice deepening and turning into a hissing gurgle. "God killed himself to make this world and your world and everything in between." She brought her other hand up, and now the waves of pleasure I had felt were replaced with burning pain as she scratched me with huge talons that had suddenly exploded out of her fingers. Her skin began to blacken, but the eyes stayed green, expanding into circles of luminescent viridescent light between folds of black, rotted skin. Massive black wings unfurled behind her, squirming with millions of maggots that constantly fell to the ground, writhing as they tried to return home. The smell of the wings made me gag, reminding me of a combination of burning rubber and rotting roadkill. I screamed, clutching my cheek and feeling blood running down it in rivulets. I turned, running away from this monster as fast as I could. The eyes above me seemed to move faster, as if they had been agitated. At that moment, 4 people rushed down from the forest, waving swords and crossbows. They barely seemed to notice me, focusing entirely on the female shapeshifter behind me. She hissed at them like a snake, sending her long, forked tongue flicking out of her mouth and pulling her glowing sword from its scabbard. With a battle cry that made my ears ring, she rushed forward, slicing off the head of the man in front of me. I saw it fly across the air in slow motion, the man's body falling to its knees. He still had a look of surprise in his eyes when his head landed a few feet to the left of his body on the tropical white sands of the ground. The others wasted no time, using the distraction with a front sword-wielding man to attack her ferociously. One shot her in the neck with a crossbow, the bolt piercing through and reminding me ludicrously of the bolts on the neck of Frankenstein's monster. She screamed with rage and pain as another rushed her from the left, swinging a massive broadsword at her jaw. Time seemed to slow down as their sword connected, cutting through the skin of the monster easily. As it penetrated deeper, sickly green light began to shoot out of the wound, and by the time he had fully decapitated her, the light was so blinding I could no longer look. "We have to go," a woman screamed, pointing up to the tops of the massive trees. Looking up, I saw dozens of flying specks, looking like an agitated hornet's nest as they regrouped and began to approach. I squinted my eyes. I realized they were more of the black-skinned monstrosities, coming to the aid of the one this group of humans had just killed. I doubted whether they would be able to help her, as one glance at her body showed me her head hung on only by the spine and the associated ligaments and flesh in the back of the neck. She didn't move anymore, and the sickening green light had all evaporated. The maggots still swarmed, however, and voraciously began to move from the wings to the rest of the body. The woman grabbed my arm, forcing me to run into the forest with her. The rest of the group was ahead of us. I heard the shrill battle cry of the flying monsters landing behind us, but the woods were growing thicker, and the constant sharp turns of the leading members of our group would make it harder to find us. After a couple of minutes of running, the shrieking and screaming falling further and further behind us, the man in front stopped suddenly. He opened up a camouflage tunnel, pushing aside some of the silver leaves that covered the top of it. The rest of the group jumped down, then the man gestured for me to jump down. The fall was only a few feet, and I realized there were torches burning in a cramped tunnel. I walked forward, hearing the man close the door and land just behind me, pushing me forward. We quickly came to a round room with a massive long table down the middle of it. Dozens of swords, crossbows, daggers and tridents covered it. All seemed to glow with their own soft silver light. At the nearest end, the table was cleared and chairs were set up around a steaming pot. A chubby man ladled out bowls of delicious smelling stew, smelling of mint, rosemary, potatoes and beef. He motioned for us to come sit down and eat. I hadn't realized it until then, but I was absolutely ravenous. They introduced themselves and we sat down to eat. They poured delicious smelling wines from crystal pitchers, and I ate the beef stew and drank red wine as they told me everything. "This is heaven," the chubby man said, sitting down on the bench across from me and pouring himself a glass of the wine. "Or at least, it used to be. This isn't heaven like most people think of it anymore. Remember, I don't know all of this absolutely, but I've heard most of it from the angels and the others who have been here a long time, so at least most of it is true." "You mean that shape-shifting monster?" I began. He nodded. "Those are the angels. They have become rabid and evil over the last few billion years, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Nearly 14 billion years ago, God killed himself to create the universe. He cut himself open and let eternal amounts of mass, energy, and consciousness pour out of his body, an action which became known to us as the Big Bang. All of this matter had nowhere to go within God's body, so it created our universe instead. Now, God dying isn't like you or me dying, you understand? God dies very, very slowly. It is like he's been bleeding out this entire time. But now, he is truly close to death. In our universe's timeline, maybe another 1,000 years at most, and he will be gone. Once he goes, the entire universe as we know it will go too. It'll instantly turn into blackness once the light of his consciousness no longer lights the stars and worlds of our universe. These angels here, they got an idea that if they fed the human souls in heaven to God's mouth, he would live slightly longer, and it seems to be working. Every time they feed him a few thousand souls, he seems to heal slightly, but he is still dying. At most, they might delay the end by a few centuries, but even that seems doubtful. The man shook his face, his jowls shaking slightly. You can't really die in heaven. Even if you get your head cut off, it'll grow back after a couple hours. But if they feed you to God's mouth, then you do, in essence, die. Your consciousness is digested by God, and it is fed throughout his body, dissipating into the eternity within him. So, where is God's mouth? I asked. And all the people in the room looked at each other, a sour expression on their faces. It is at the end of heaven, the chubby man said, his eyes downcast. It is a horrible thing to behold. Trillions of gnashing teeth, endless insects infesting it and screaming in unison. Since his body began to fall apart, the insects of heaven have really begun to consume his flesh. I think it is driving God insane. A lot of the terrible things in our world might be arising from his insanity and dying. The wars, the mass killings. But that is just speculation. I don't know that for sure. At that moment, I heard a loud crash outside. Shouts and running from above us made everyone deathly silent. Then, the hidden trapdoor leading down here was flung open, and angels began pouring down the opening, carrying glowing swords and crossbows. They instantly attacked, dozens more coming from behind them. They slashed at the chef. He absurdly raised his wine glass in front of him as if that would stop the sword flying down towards his skull. But instead, it cleaved his face in two and he fell backwards. Within seconds, everyone except me was moaning, dead or dying on the ground. I instinctively picked up my wooden bowl, spilling stew all over myself on the floor. The angels began to pull the hacked-up bodies of the others they had murdered out, then approached me, their dead, black eyes staring daggers at me as I backed against the dirt wall on the hidden shelter. Just as they had surrounded me, and one was raising his sword to cut me open, I began hearing sounds that didn't fit. "Clear! Again! He's waking up!" As the sword came down to my face, I suddenly opened my eyes. My other eyes, feeling the cold, damp pavement beneath my body. I looked around and saw myself surrounded by paramedics, a lifestar helicopter loudly descending 100 feet further down the road. I saw the woman who'd run out in front of my car in the back of an ambulance. I looked down and saw the wooden bowl in my hand still, cleaved in two by a sword, remnants of herbs and sauce still clinging to the inside of it. Then I closed my eyes and fell back asleep. The doctors at the hospital told me I had been clinically dead for 5 minutes. Apparently, the woman I'd almost hit was the latest victim of a serial killer. She had escaped from him and ran blindly into the road out of mortal terror. I didn't blame her in the least, and was simply glad I hadn't hit her. I still have the wooden bowl I brought back with me, and the slices on my cheek from that thing I encountered. Once I get out of here, I want to send the remnants of the bowl to a scientific institute to see what it is truly made out of. I have a feeling it is not a kind of wood anyone on earth has ever seen before. The vision of heaven I had received was the most disturbing thing of the entire experience. It truly changed my life, and not for the better. I wasn't afraid of dying before, but I certainly am now. I am part of the 110th generation at this facility. For as long as I can remember, I've worked here. Any memories of my time before are non-existent. I believe it's the same for the others who work here. But it's a don't ask, don't tell topic. Working here, it's rare that 2 days are the same. Each day has a plethora of nuances. Some tasks are rather mundane. Every few weeks, I have to feed the tunnel, a borehole that smells faintly like sulfur. The task is to take a bucket of giblets and offcut bones to the hole to pour in. Sometimes it looks like there's a faint white powder sprinkled on top of the meats, which looks too fine to be salt. I still don't know what it is or what's in the hole, but it's better not to ask questions. I just do my task and move on. However, some tasks aren't as straightforward. Something we're all assigned to be on the lookout for is to report the location of the husk. While walking around the facility, on the floor, in a room or even a corridor, you'll sometimes see a dried up human-shaped husk. It looks like what an insect would leave behind after shedding its skin, though there are no openings. Dark grey and semi-translucent. Though the position sometimes changes, the face is always warped into a wailing face of anguish, and its limbs are often contorted into an uncomfortable fetal position. It never moves, and after being reported, no one has stuck around to see what happens, but it's never there the next day. After sighting, you have to report it to the higher-ups and carry on with your shift. Past then, the husk only proves to be a trip hazard. Currently, tripping on the husk has a 100% mortality rate. Personally, I've never seen it happen, but through the grapevine, I've heard of someone that has. They caught sight of a technician who was fumbling with a folder and didn't notice the husk until it was too late. I was told that he fell straight to the ground as soon as his foot hit the object. At first, it looked like he just caught a nasty fall from the surprise. However, the portion of the leg that nicked the body was missing. Just gone. The trouser hole empty and his shoe was off to the side. The technician immediately started screaming as he grabbed his leg, but not the missing part. He had his hands around where his knee was, wailing in agony. At first, they thought it was because of the pain of his leg being inexplicably removed, but soon his hands clasped together and his otherwise neat-fitting clothes sagged higher and higher. Everyone around realized more of him was disappearing, black dust falling from the empty trouser hole. The rest of his clothes emptied from the bottom up until the screaming stopped, and a discarded outfit remained. It was called in, and everyone moved on. There's no time to dwell here on the happenings of others. Too much downtime like that can get you written up. Because of such events, it's sometimes better to avoid making friends. A lot of new people are hauled in, not always at once, but sometimes that's the case depending on the severity of a recent incident. Often, the fresh faces are confused, bewildered, or straight up manic. It's not easy working here, so it's especially not easy when you're new. There's a lot to adapt to, and you must adjust fast. One fresh face was friendly, introduced himself readily to anyone around. This is not the norm, and he was brushed off by many of the more senior staff. However, I was still relatively new myself. I knew the feeling of wanting familiar faces around me, so I took the bait. We shook hands. He told me his name, though I didn't tell mine. But otherwise, just engaging with him was the most anyone had given him since he'd arrived, and he seemed to find comfort in our short, one-sided conversation. From then on, he would hover over me during our downtime. Spending your break rubbing shoulders with whoever is around is normal here. No one is particularly close, so it means you just mildly get along with anyone close by just a vent. However, this guy always seemed to find me when we had breaks that lined up. He was generally very polite, if not a bit too open, in contrast to what we're used to here. I hadn't seen him on shift until an incident occurred. He was assigned to the quiet room for a few hours. It's a sterile white room with a small black box atop a metal table. As the name suggests, being quiet is of the utmost importance. Before going in, you're made to change into a frictionless, skin-tight suit to avoid the sound of brushing clothing fabrics. No electronics are to be taken in if an emergency pings your personal device. Fortunately, you're notified of outside emergencies via a light that will flash red if an evacuation is needed. It sounds daunting, but you are simply required to ensure everything in the room is in order and observe the box for any irregularities. The new guy does this to the letter. First, he went around to check all angles, looking at the front and viewing all sides of the box. Then, he simply stood there and observed the box, only moving around occasionally to recheck the other angles. I was stationed outside to ensure his entry and exit were executed correctly. After a few hours, the yellow light blinked, which meant it was time for him to leave. He slowly made his way to the exit. I quietly opened the door, and just before the door latched, he breathed a sigh of relief. I froze, knowing what he just did. Though you have to maintain silence in the room, there is leniency. The blood rushing in your veins, your heart pumping, your lungs taking in air. All of these are not enough to set off the box. However, his sigh just tipped over what was acceptable. A grumble groaned from inside the box, and he looked at me, dismayed. He opened his mouth, but before he could exclaim anything, I clamped my hand over it and pulled him down as quietly as I could. There we just lay, as we heard movement from inside. A stretching and twisting could be heard, the clatter of the box hitting the ground. Then suddenly, a black tendril poked its way through the door. I could tell he wanted to scream, but I wasn't letting him so much as breathe, even if it meant he'd suffocate. The tendril just hung there, tilting around, not looking, but listening. After a tense amount of time, it slowly retreated. I gently got back up, holding a finger over my lips to make sure he knew to stay quiet. He quietly peeled open the door. I went in softly, slowly picked up the now benign box, and gently placed it on the table. I slipped back out and gently closed the door. After that, I let out my own sigh, knowing it was safe to do so, and he followed suit. Once we were a safe enough distance away, he thanked me profusely. After some hollow assurance, I let him on his way. The day after, he excitedly found me. Apparently, the higher-ups learned of what happened and decided to give him a promotion. I smiled as best I could and congratulated him. I've seen promotions given a number of times, and anyone who's been around long enough knows it's not good. You get assigned to another area, one which we have never been to and are never seen again. No one knows what happens to repurposed staff. Still, we collectively agree it can't be good, as only the incompetent seem to get these promotions. I never saw him again, and he'll never know it was me who told the higher-ups what happened. I feel bad for doing so, but not reporting something like that is also grounds for promotion, and they always find out. I've heard of people lying, trying to throw another under the bus, but it never works. They always know. This is one of many reasons to keep a distance from others. But there is someone everyone is friendly to though. Greg the Mystic. If you're in the social quarters, you'll often see a homeless-looking man wearing a wizard's robe made from old bed sheets. People often cheer and smile at him because he's one of the few good oddities in the facility. He's so unthreatening that he's one of the only oddities that isn't confined, which is good because he never took to confinement well. It's often good to keep conversations short with Greg though. A greeting, a how do you do, and a goodbye. However, the temptation to talk longer is always present. That's because if you talk with Greg long enough, he'll offer to read your future. You can even ask him if he doesn't offer to, though there are rules to what you can and cannot ask. The rule of thumb is to ask inane questions. you don't want to know something you're not supposed to. The one thing guaranteed when he reads your future is that Greg is always wrong. I asked him what was for lunch, and he told me pizza. I went to the canteen, and what do you know? Tacos. At first, it seems like a laughable idea to call yourself a mystic, confidently make readings, yet always be wrong. But when I say he's always wrong, I mean he's wrong 100% of the time. One experiment was run in which they had him guess the outcoin of a coin flip for as long as they could hold his attention. The sweet guy stayed engaged for hours playing, and they managed to get over 1,000 flips. Every guess was wrong. Every single one. To the degree that it pretty much confirmed it's not just a statistical anomaly. Something else is at play here. However, coin flips are harmless. You can't extrapolate relevant information from a coin flip. However, extracting useful information is possible by learning what won't happen. Will the surgery to implement a cybernetic enhanced limb go successfully? Greg said it'll go smoothly, and the patient would be overjoyed at having full control over their new device. The surgery was cancelled, and the project was shelved until the science could be refined. Obviously, this isn't foolproof. You can only extrapolate so much from a negative response, since learning what won't happen is one of many outcomes. But he's proven a great asset to the company and a fun addition to worker morale. Greg's status is ongoing, with subtle tests still being administered in passing. The position you fill here isn't a set schedule. A lot of the time, they keep you working certain hours to maintain a sense of normalcy, but sometimes you're given a shift on an alternate time frame. Usually, I'm a day shift worker, but some nights I'm given duties in the observatory. The floor I'm made to work on must be close to the surface because it revolves around a high-powered telescope. From this, I'm able to gather that I live and work far below ground, though the specifics are beyond me. This telescope automatically calibrates to a certain spot in the sky and observes only one object: a planet. Most people have a basic understanding of the planets on our solar system. However, this one never came up in school. From context, I've picked up that it can only be observed when viewed through some alternative wavelength, whether it's infrared, ultraviolet, or something entirely new. My job isn't to know the details, so I'll probably never learn them. But when I'm working here, I'm to assist a technician in the lab to observe this planet. It seems benign. One would think it is void of life, but that doesn't guarantee our safety. One theory posits that life on the planet lives below the surface, so constant observation is mandated in case any signs of servicing are spotted. However, it's hard with the current technology of the lab. I imagine a more powerful version of the telescope is being worked on. Another theory I heard is that the life forms can't be seen by whatever wavelength we've dialed to. Sure, we can see the planet, but there are planets you can observe with your bare eye. So it wouldn't be wild to think that we need to refine whatever wavelength is being used to intensify the readings of the planet. I'm sure they're working on this too. For now, things seem benign, but I still get an itch on my neck just thinking about if something there is observing us the same way we watch them. Maybe they're having the same troubles as us. I'm hoping that if there is civilization there, that they're friendly. because if not, whatever we're working on would be closer to an arms race than a rush for discovery. Working in the observatory is one of the few floors where I go up, but most of my shifts involve going down, sometimes far down. And there's a shift I often get that I dread. Cleanup on floor B66. This floor was home to an experiment gone awry. Whatever had gotten out is hidden away in a deep crevice and hasn't been found since. What's worse is that it seems to be able to replicate itself. So the job is to go around and exterminate anything that moves. They look like round balls of fur. The biggest are about the size of a volleyball. On their own, they aren't too dangerous. Under the fur, they have a leech-like mouth with barbed teeth that latch quickly through skin. You're given a level of protective plating that covers a lot of your body, but there are gaps in the armor, and they can easily hit if you're not fast enough. How they get you are the thin tubes in their teeth that rapidly suck out liquids. So if you're hit, you have to rip them off fast, but the barbs latch on deep, and you'll be bleeding a lot, which will only bring more. One of them isn't an issue. 2 or 3 are manageable, but if left too long, clusters can gather. One upside to this shift is that you get to play with some of the facility's toys. Even though there's power on the floor, most of the lights are out. From cursory glances, it's presumed that these creatures had gnawed through many of the wires, maybe while digging in the walls for an escape. So, we're given a light. It's called the Firefly, a frosted glass ball with a circle divot at the bottom. I can only presume something in the divot is what makes it float, because this companion drone will silently follow you wherever you go. The Firefly emits a light all around in a harsh yellow glow, enough to illuminate most of a corridor you're in, or even an entire room. These Fireflies have been around since the 85th generation and haven't been updated since. It's that tried and true. The same can't be said about the weapon. In the past, you were armed with a few firearms. Percussive hits worked well to initially stun, then finish off those little furballs. But accuracy plays a significant part in your survival. With how small and fast they are, it's not hard to imagine why the task's survival rate would be rocky. So the technicians have been hard at work, and for around the 108th generation, a medium-ranged arc thrower was introduced. It whirs up and quickly shoots a jolt of electricity towards the direction you're facing. Something in the furball seems to be conductive, because you only have to aim in the general direction, which is much better than trying to hit one mid-jump with a 9mm. Whatever makes them so malleable to fit through small gaps also seems to mean their membrane is so thin that they perish after one harsh jolt. And the battery lasts long enough to last even a hectic shift, making the job much more trivial on an easy day. However, not every day is an easy one. It isn't confirmed whether they have a higher intelligence or it's just coincidence. Still, the furballs have been known to set up some devious situations. A report was made that 2 furballs were sitting in a hallway about 30 paces through a doorway. The worker needed to step through to get in range to hit both at once. It was only after he stepped through that he realized the situation. A furball was lurking above behind the doorframe, and as he focused on the 2 in the hallway, the lone furball dropped down and went straight into the back of his neck, between the joints of his helmet and backplate. The Firefly documented this and posed a warning for future shift workers. The person who took the next shift had a nightmare cleaning this up, because they had a lot to feed on, and he reported that there was an entire wall covered with these things. To survive a shift is what's expected. Any less, and more often than not, you don't make it out, or you get promoted. Something I found is that there doesn't seem to be a ladder to climb within the company. I think it has something to do with my position. I'm not in some lab discovering world-bending technologies. I work the floor and maintain the status quo. But I did once get the attention of the higher-ups. It didn't happen on a shift, but rather between them. I was traveling through one of the floors to transfer between two elevators, and on my usual route, I noticed a stain in a lesser used hallway. It was a brownish splash, and my first thought was that a technician had spilled their coffee. I figured it would be cleaned and went on to my shift. When I passed by again, it was still there. Not only that, but it was bigger and darker, now almost a strong shade of black. I reported it and moved on. I was assigned the same task later in the week and had to pass through that same section. Expecting the mess to be cleaned up, I was surprised when the hallways were cordoned off and I was escorted around, taking much longer to start my shift. It only got worse from then on. Each time I passed by, more and more of that floor's block was sectioned off. After a month, no one was there to walk me around. The pale yellow curtains that blocked viewing of the area were all gone. I tried to make my way through my old route, but was blocked off, this time by a wall. Where I first saw the stain, there was now a whole new lab. Technicians rushed by, seemingly working overtime with so many tasks on their hands. I later learned what happened when I was assigned to assist in that section. The stain grew. At first they tried cleaning it, but it never changed no matter what substance or abrasive they used. Eventually it stopped spreading, and when it did, it resembled the silhouette of a man. Day by day though, it no longer grew outwards, but rather up. Slowly and seemingly inevitably, a person is coming out of it. Right now it's being studied, but nothing is known of what will happen when the figure emerges. On the plus side, I was rewarded for reporting it. They gave me an hour with a music box. From my experience, most of the things we deal with here are hell, but not all of them are otherworldly threats to humanity. Some are objects of bizarre uses, one of which is the music box. Long-term exposure has been known to have adverse effects. However, in the short term, it has provided ample reward for especially outstanding work in the field. The object itself looks ornate, but otherwise unremarkable compared to the horrors here. It's a dark, stained oak wooden box with grooves etched around to distinguish the edges. The outside is smoothed with a polished varnish, and across the top is a detailed carving of a snake wrapped in a mother-of-pearl-like effect around an apple with a juicy red resin fill. On the side is a polished brass handle which is used to crank the box. It sits in a rather fittingly decorated room. Wooden bookshelves holding ancient-looking books, all filled with blank pages. A deep crimson Chesterfield chair sits next to an artificial fireplace. A wooden globe rests nearby, along with an empty decanter and decorated crystal whiskey glasses. To sit there alone could be rewarding enough for some. However, it's once you start the music box that the magic happens. I was given 3 cranks for my efforts. There is no countermeasure for if you sneak extra cranks in. However, I can only imagine the hell you'd wrought if you overplayed your hand. After all, this is a privilege you don't want to be revoked. It'll be hard to fully convey why the music box is so great, because after 3 generous cranks, I sat back in the comfort of the single chair and blacked out. When I awoke, my eyes were watery from fresh tears, a bit of crust on the sides of my eyes. There was a taste of nostalgia lingering in the air. A feeling of overwhelming splendor carried through me for the rest of the week. No one knows what happens when you listen to the music box. The few of us who have used it were alone, as mandated by the instructions. We do have our theories though. One person thought it transcended you to some astral realm, a brief reprieve from the hell we work in, but only spiritually, because we can't imagine the higher-ups ever letting us physically leave this place. Another person thought it simply evoked every positive emotion you can feel, so much so that you black out, yet keep the dopamine and serotonin from the experience for the next few days. I have my own theory. I wonder if it evokes your memories from before coming here. My memories start in this place, and all the fresh recruits are about the same age. We must have had a life before this, which was taken. Maybe it brings back the memories of family, ordinary life, and the peace we used to have, of which we're only allocated a certain time with. God knows what the higher-ups would do if we ever had knowledge of the outside world, because our drive would no longer be of the efficiency of the facility, but the ability to get out. We're subdued with a mix of fear and complacency, so to have something to fight for, I know of many who would die to try achieving it. But this theory is a bit of a stretch, or maybe even a hope, and it's one I keep to myself. All I know is that the music box was not made in the labs here. A lot of the stuff here is brought in from outside. But that doesn't mean our problems only come externally, because we also have our own internal issues. I mentioned that this place runs on generations. No one knows what signifies a jump in a generation. It's not annually or any set time period. I know this because I've seen a generation jump after 2 years and another time after 2 weeks. However it is determined, it's also how certain things are labelled. I mentioned that I'm part of the 110th generation. Currently, we're in the 117th. All the people working here are a mix of older and newer generations than me. But the same also applies to technology. I mentioned that the Fireflies are 85th Gen Tech and the Arc Thrower was 108th. These are things we still have stock of and are still being produced to this day. But some tech runs so far back that even the generation number has been lost. With the nature of the facility, archiving isn't the most reliable. On top of that, sometimes entire sectors are lost due to incidents, so some knowledge and tech are lost entirely. And a vital tech that we're slowly running out of is the sleep tubes. It's estimated that they're from around the 15th to 23rd generation. They're long glass tubes filled with a pale yellowish chemical, topped off with a plastic cover. I work with them sometimes, and what we do with them is simple. If you go to floor B66, you'll find a huge circular pit. There are no guard railings around the catwalk, so you have to be careful when navigating the low-light environment. The pit goes so far down that it's almost pitch black. Though it's not advised, if you shine a light down there, you can't see to the bottom. However, you can hear it. A rhythmic groan that pulsates at a slow tempo. You might not figure out what it is when you're there, but when you're told what you're doing, it becomes apparent what it is. It's snoring. Whatever is down there is in a deep sleep. The job is to silently carry the tube to the device along the east catwalk, make sure it's plastic side down, and put the tube in. Once secured, you pull the lever. A clunk will go off, and the liquid rapidly depletes downwards. A loud groan will echo around the chamber, but stay quiet, and eventually, the snoring will resume. Take the tube out, which will now have a puncture in the plastic, and dispose of it. Then, you're done. Whatever is down there is currently in a perpetual state of slumber, and it's solely because of this chemical. The problem is, we're quickly running out. The storage room for them used to be full when I started, but this is one of the 5 storage rooms, the rest of which are empty. But now we're down to the last quarter of this room stock, which means once these are out, we're out for good. Right now, technicians are hard at work over this, either trying to replicate them or develop a new system to keep up the perpetual slumber. I don't know of their progress, but to me, it's looking dire. The technicians occasionally take a sample to run tests. I understand the urgency, but each time they take a sleep tube to run tests, that's one less we workers have to use. We're burning the candle at both ends, and it's worrying. There are a lot of duties that aren't talked about in downtime. Either they've become a mundane part of the job, or simply because we want a reprieve from the daunting tasks we are given. But one shift is talked about in hushed circles: the final shift. This isn't the official name of the task, but rather a nickname given by the workers. When it's been assigned, it's the hot topic of the day, because it might be the last time you ever see that person. The final shift is performed deep on floor B100. I'm not sure if that's the deepest level of the facility, but it's the furthest I've personally been on. Often, there are many experiment sectors within a single floor, but this is an entire level dedicated to this one task. I entered the longest elevator ride I'd ever been on, and when the doors dinged open, I was met with a whole floor bathed in a green light. The instructions are clear and important. Familiarize yourself for a few minutes. Once the lights turn red, it begins. The floor was like any other. Sterile cold hallways, viewing windows into small labs, and various storage units. However, each one I opened was empty. Barely any marring on the edges. Everything here is almost like a prop, set up to make the appearance of a normal floor with none of the actual function. I found a few rooms with human-sized storage units and a few torn open ducts that I could fit into, and mapped out a clear path through the hallways, making mental notes of any dead ends. When the light turned red, I didn't get as much as I'd have liked done. And immediately, there was a noise. Something stalked around a few turns. I was no longer alone. The game of cat and mouse had begun. I softly slipped through rooms, I ran when chased. I came dangerously close to death many times. I spent nearly 10 minutes in a locker, with whatever it was just knocking on various cabinets in the room. It knocked on my locker a few times, but I held in a whimper long enough for it to not look inside. I was chased through several hallways, and while looking behind, I tripped. I saw the culprit, a discarded leg of a previous worker on the final shift. I almost got a good look at the thing, large, humanoid in shape. Its silhouette turned the corner, and it never slowed. Whether it was for hunger or sport, it wanted to get to me as soon as possible. But as it skirted around the corner, the lights changed. I was bathed in a tinge of green, and the thing stopped, turned, and left. It was unceremonious. No final confrontation with the creature, no grand escape from death, not even a disgruntled gesture of defeat from the thing. It simply wandered away. There isn't much context to go off, but talking to the few other survivors of the final shift that I knew of, we have some ideas. Whatever it is that chases us lives exclusively on that floor, and it's given about an hour to play each week, sometimes more if it's getting restless. And when it plays for keeps. With my experience added to our collective information, it strictly sticks to the red light green light setup. But many aren't as lucky. We've lost a lot of people to the final shift, so being known as someone who's gotten through a shift is a badge of honor. It doesn't get you anything from the higher-ups. After all, to them, I'd simply just done my job. But it commands an aura of respect among the workers. It may seem like torture, but after an hour with that thing, I know for a fact none of us could last much longer than that. So in some twisted way, this system makes sense. This way, it's only dangerous for an hour. If that thing ever got restless and decided to play around the whole facility, all hell would break loose. Though I don't tell this to anyone. I grumble with the rest that it's a torturous system that should be abolished. And this is just one of the many duties we have to do. No 2 days are the same, and for each task or incident I've mentioned, there are hundreds that I haven't. And even then, I haven't seen everything there is to do here. But hey, it's all part of the job. My son, Robbie, has been going through a rough patch. His girlfriend had left him, and his cat of 15 years had just died. He loved that cat as if it were his own child. It slept next to him every night, curled up in his arms like a teddy bear. I knew he was using opioids as well, and no matter how much we tried to help him, he simply couldn't stop. But a couple of weeks ago, things started getting better. Robbie looked a lot happier. He seemed to have hope again. I saw him smiling and laughing, and I figured he had gotten over the hump. "I see things clearly now," he said to me and his mother over breakfast one morning. I smiled. "That's good. Suffering makes you a stronger man," I said. "No great man has ever lived without great suffering to first harden him." He nodded. I went to bed early, confident that things were looking up. I was sleeping that night when I heard the gunshot. "No!" I heard my wife shriek in an agonized voice, the voice of a mother losing a child, her only child, The sound seemed to go on, and I think I still hear it sometimes when I close my eyes, but maybe it never really stopped. She screamed like a woman on fire. I sprinted towards the noise, my feet feeling as heavy as cinder blocks. "Alexis," I cried into the dark hallway. My heart felt like a cold chunk of ice in my chest. I ran blindly through the shadows, knocking a vase off a table as I passed. It exploded on the floor with a sound like bones shattering. "What's wrong?" My voice sounded like someone else's. Everything seemed slow and dreamlike. I wasn't sure whether this was really happening to me. I felt totally dissociated from everything, a state that would continue for days afterwards. The only response that came to my calls were more hysterical sobbing and incoherent screaming. I flew through Robbie's open bedroom door and saw a scene from a nightmare. A shotgun was sprawled at his feet, thrown onto the hardwood floor like a discarded toy. Robbie sat in a recliner. His face was almost entirely gone. I saw deeply into his skull and brain matter. He had blown off everything from the top of his mouth to his nose, to his right eye and right cheek. His forehead had imploded like a smashed pumpkin. The left eye gazed sightlessly ahead, wide open and as blank as a statue's. I felt a tight constriction in my chest. I grabbed at it, falling over. I remember the darkness interspersed with flashing lights and voices from 1,000 miles away, piercing the void. I reached out, trying to escape, but the darkness seemed eternal. I woke up in the hospital, surrounded by the sounds of beeping machines and soft footsteps. I opened my eyes and found myself in a hospital bed. A few minutes later, a doctor came in and told me I had suffered a mild heart attack and would undoubtedly have permanent heart damage. However, my wife, even though physically unscathed, was in even worse shape. I remember walking to the psychiatrist's ward a few days later. My heart still felt tight and constricted, as if the cage of bones around it had clenched down with their finger-like ribs. The nurse was a large woman dressed in faded green scrubs and had a face like a tired weasel. Her brown eyes looked out at me from drooping facial features. Her many chins wriggled and danced as she led me through the hallways of madness. I passed by a schizophrenic man in his early 20s. He talked to himself, walking in circles. He reminded me of people I had seen on bad acid trips, except this trip never ended. I saw the birds, green birds in the mountains. Sightless eyes are green too. Why do they always drink from the poison stream? A lunatic god with sightless eyes. I see. I passed on by, extremely interested. I wanted to ask the young man more, but the nurse kept hurrying me along, and then I remembered the grim circumstances I was actually there for. My wife was in the room at the end of the hall. It was sparse. Only a desk, dresser and bed stood there, all nailed to the floor. Laying on the bed, I saw my wife. Her arms were extended up towards the ceiling like a child asking to be picked up by a parent. She didn't move or speak. She appeared as an eerie, living statue, laying there with open eyes. Her breath came in slow, steady rasps. "She is in a catatonic state," someone said from behind me. I turned, seeing a doctor in a white lab coat entering the room. He had striking blue eyes, the color of an Arctic glacier, and deep wrinkles around his aristocratic mouth. His hawk-like nose gave his face a serious, reflective character. He walked over to Alexis. Her once golden skin looked pale and lifeless. Her eyes had sunk deep into her face like the last bit of water at the bottom of a deep well. "She is what we call waxy flexibility." He took a left wrist and, like moving the joint of a mannequin, pushed her arm down towards the bed so that it was at a 45-degree angle to the mattress instead of a 90-degree angle. Her arm hung there, unmoving. It was eerie seeing my wife turned into a doll, her mind apparently shattered. "How long?" I said through a hoarse, choked voice. I felt drained from my stay in the hospital and the trauma of the last few days. "How long will she be like this, doctor?" He looked away. "I'm sorry, but that's impossible to say," he said. "We are doing everything we can, however. We are giving her electroshock therapy." "Electroshock?" I asked, aghast. He nodded grimly. "This is usually a sign of schizophrenia. Does she have a history of mental illness?" I shrugged. "Not that I know of," I said. "Traumatic incidents can sometimes trigger it in people who are genetically predisposed," he said in an impassive voice. "It's possible she has had symptoms before and she simply hid them. You never notice strange behavior like paranoia or disordered speech or hallucinations?" "Well," I said, thinking back to the incident last month, "she did say something about seeing a ghost in Robbie's bedroom." "A ghost," the doctor said, his mouth hanging open slightly. He quickly regained his regal bearing, giving a slight smile. "That could certainly be a sign of hallucinations. Did she physically see the ghost standing there? Did she talk to it or have contact with it?" I thought back to that strange night. Thinking of Robbie again brought back a sick, empty feeling in my heart. "I saw someone peeking in through the window," Alexis whispered in a quivering voice, her dark eyes wide and frayed. "The window of Robbie's room?" I jumped from the chair, taking out my phone and keeping 911 on the screen so that I could press send and start the call immediately if necessary. I ran into the master bedroom, pulling clothes up from my dresser to reveal the rifle hidden there underneath. It was a beautiful gun, a Springfield 2020 Redline. I always kept it loaded in case of an intruder. Taking it out, I flicked off the safety and, with my phone screen still turned on in my pocket, sprinted into Robbie's room. Robbie's room was on the 3rd floor, but I never second-guessed Alexis. She was brutally honest, almost to the point of absurdity. She wouldn't even use her sick time at work unless she was actually sick, because she felt bad about lying to her manager. So when she said something, I instantly believed it. My mind raced. I wondered if someone had a ladder against the side of the house and was trying to break in. It was the only thing that made sense after all, unless Jesus had decided to descend back down from the clouds and fly around for a while. I looked in Robbie's empty bedroom. For a moment, I thought I saw something skeletal peeking over the edge of the sill. It seemed to have eyes like a possum caught in the headlights, glowing an eerie cataract white. I thought I caught a glimpse of writhing snakes twisting lazily in the breeze, their eyes open and mouths slightly pressed together, as if in expressions of disapproval. I blinked and found the window empty. I strode over and looked down, seeing nothing. I went back and told Alexis there was nothing there. Her lithe body felt light and free as I wrapped my arms around her, hugging her. She began to cry, her shaking chest pressed tight to mine. After getting home from visiting Alexis in the psychiatric ward, I found myself alone in the sprawling house. It felt eerie. My footsteps seemed to echo far too loudly in my ears. I decided to investigate Robbie's room. In the silence, I could always hear my own damaged heart, each beat like a sand grain in an hourglass flowing toward death. But perhaps that was a good thing. Perhaps I would see my mother and father again, my grandparents, my old dog, my son, and all the others I had lost. I remembered a story my friend Angela told me after she had converted to Buddhism. She had lost her daughter in a drunk driving crash a few years earlier. She had started to lose her mind in worsening waves of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Yet, a few months later, when I talked to her, I found her eyes bright and her mind recovered. She had the look of a true fanatic, yet she also emanated a peace I had rarely seen. She told me a story I would never forget. The Buddha once had a similar case in the ancient scriptures. A woman had gone mad with grief over the loss of her only son. She would walk the town, her mind shattered, screaming for a boy. So the Buddha was in the area. The woman came to him weeping, asking him to bring her son back. The Buddha said he would bring her son back, but that he needed her to find an ingredient for the ritual first. She had to find a grain of rice from a house that had never lost a loved one. She wandered the area, asking every person she could find if they had never lost a loved one. But they all told her, "No, I lost a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter." The woman went back to Buddha and told him she could not find a single house where death and loss had not taken place. She began to realize that death and suffering was universal for all beings in every moment, and her mind began to clear. "So it is," the Buddha said. "So it is. Grief, suffering, lamentation and stress come from one who is dear, from those who we love. But true bliss comes from not clinging, from not craving, from non-attachment to all things." Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the freshly painted white door to Robbie's room. The place looked Spartan now. The blood and gore had stained many of his possessions. I had a professional cleaning company come in and throw them away. The hardwood floors had also been ripped up and replaced in the worst areas where massive puddles of blood had dripped through the cracks. Tears came to my eyes. I inhaled for a long moment, blinking my eyes fast to try to clear them. I saw his notebook on a bookshelf in the corner. I went over, looking through them, until I found a slim, black volume titled Diary. As I flipped to the first page, a drawing of Robbie sleeping as something hideous with melting skin and glowing eyes lay next to him. This abomination wasn't sleeping, however. It stared right at Robbie with excited, lidless eyes and grinned. Next to it, I saw some verses scrawled in Robbie's spiky, copperplate handwriting. It was an old poem written by one of his favourite poets, Gene Jones. I had heard Robbie recite it from memory a while back, and it had given me the creeps. On top of the page stood the title in large, slashing letters. "The angel of death sleeps beside me." At night, her black hair, her dark eyes, stare at me like photographs I have hanging from the wall. She is a skull, grinning constantly at me. She is smiling, and her eyes flash every time she stares at me. I'm in love with her. I want to go where she goes, where normal women can never go. The place where we all meet in the end. The harvest ground, the wet, cold earth. There is tiredness to this land, and everything in me feels it. From the way I pour sugar in my coffee every morning to the time it takes for me to close my eyes and remember nothing. Everything is nothing to that smile you have, though. I want to go and find out where it comes from. Show me. I sat on the couch in the living room, looking at the empty ashtray sitting on the table. One doctor with a face like a shriveled grape had told me I needed to quit smoking. His ancient eyes looked like chips of flat sapphire as he reiterated over and over how lucky I was that my heart attack was mild and didn't require surgery. Instead, they had given me aspirin, nitroglycerine, morphine, and blood thinners. Though the damage to my heart was permanent, it was fairly minor, but he stated that if I kept smoking a couple packs a day and not exercising, It would very likely be serious or even fatal next time. I sighed, nervously taking some nicotine gum and chewing it as Robbie's journal lay on the coffee table in front of me. Its cover looked shiny and dangerous, like the black skin of some venomous centipede. Steeling myself, I opened it and continued reading. "She comes in different forms," he had written, and that was very nearly the last thing he had written in the entire diary. All of the online pages had drawings after that. He was a very talented artist, and I had often encouraged him to continue drawing and painting. The first drawing showed a van, its headlights looking like staring, cataract-covered eyes. In its interior, teeth hung down from the ceiling, dripping saliva. More razor-sharp fangs stuck up from the floor. A couple and a young child sat huddled in the back seat, their mouths open in silent screams as the back of the van had started to crush and close in on the family. I flipped to the next one. It showed an abomination hovering over the ground, its shadow reaching out like prodding fingers behind it. Its head was twisted around backwards so that I couldn't see its face. It had giant reptilian wings stretching out on both sides of its body like the wings of a bat, spiky and sharp and framed with narrow, curving bones. It wore a shimmering black robe and had dozens of eels or snakes growing out of its skull. Each of them had dead, white eyes and sharp, dripping fangs. Sickened, I kept flipping, finding more and more disturbing images. Finally, I got to the last page. I saw what might have been a self-portrait of Robbie, but everything looked wrong. His teeth were coloured black, his eyes shone like polished silver, full of sadistic glee and lunacy. The fingernails had become dark talons, a forked tongue peeked out through thin lips. Underneath, in small letters, he had written, "The angel of death is a scream wrapped up in a dark, sickly thing. She is eternity." I couldn't sleep that night. I stood, pacing, watching TV and chewing nicotine gum. I wanted a cigarette very badly. I kept thinking of my wife, wondering if she had woken up from a catatonic state yet. A small voice in the back of my head wondered if she would ever wake up from it, but I quickly banished it to the darkness of my subconscious. At 3:33 a.m., I heard a crashing sound at the front door. I jumped, sending my water glass shattering on the floor. It sounded as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to the door. The wood bowed inwards, as if it were made of cardboard. Another knock came, sending deep cracks skittering across it like the fault lines of an earthquake. I got up from the living room couch and ran upstairs, grabbing my rifle and some extra magazines. A minute later, the third knock came, and I heard the wood give a tortured shriek as the door splintered into 1,000 pieces far below. My breath caught in my throat. "Dad," Robbie's voice cried. It sounded sickly and diseased, as if he had been gargling with razor blades. His voice came out distorted and eerie, but I still recognized the voice as my son's. I didn't answer. I hid in the master bedroom with the door locked and the rifle pointed straight at it. I heard heavy, plodding footsteps smashing against the first floor, circling around and looking for something, looking for me. I looked in the bedroom mirror, seeing myself, a pale, thin man with black circles under his eyes, his body trembling and weak. The gun felt like a paltry piece of junk in my shaking hands. Whatever was impersonating Robbie started to ascend the stairs. I heard the wood groaning and straining as his inhumanly heavy footsteps shook the house, coming closer and closer. Finally, he arrived at the other side of the door. "Dad," Robbie gurgled. "Open up. It's time." Something smashed against the door as if an anvil had been thrown at it. The door broke along the middle, sending spidery cracks searching up and down the sides of it. I knew one more good hit would break it. Inhaling deeply, I opened fire. The ear-splitting cacophony of emptying an entire chamber as quickly as I could instantly deafened me. The smell of gun smoke hung thick in the air, but behind it, I smelled something else, something much fouler, almost like tomatoes and roadkill left out to rot together under a hot summer sun. The tinnitus in my ears had begun to subside as I took out the empty magazine, throwing it and slamming another one into the chamber. Like a man waking up from a dream, I remembered the phone in my pocket. I quickly took it out and dialed 911. It rang for what seemed like an eternity, but then finally someone picked up. "Oh, thank God," I screamed. "Please send help. I'm under attack at—" "Dad," the distorted voice hissed through the phone. "Is that you, Dad? It's so dark and cold here. I don't know where I am." I froze, the phone slipping out of my numb fingers and hitting the floor. "Go away," I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Leave me alone." I could feel my heart tightening and anxiety rising in my chest. I was supposed to be relaxing after my heart attack. For a long moment, I wondered if this would cause another one that I would never wake up from. Without warning, the door shattered inwards, raining splinters of wood down on my head. Standing on the dark threshold, I saw my son. But his eyes were white and covered in pale cataracts. He grinned, showing a mouth full of black teeth. I saw a forked, blood-red tongue in that horrible face. He oozed over the threshold. I was too stunned to react for a long time. Abruptly, he ran at me, his mouth opening far too wide, as if the tendons and ligaments in his jaw had been sliced. The snake-like tongue flicked from his unhinged mouth. A hissing emanated from deep in his chest. The smell of rotting meat became overwhelming. I raised the gun, but he smashed into me at full speed. The rifle went sliding under the bed. Unbalanced, I fell on my back, my arms pinwheeling. Gnashing his obsidian teeth, he landed on top of me. He bit at the air like a rabid dog. I had my elbow against his neck, but his strength seemed overwhelming. He slowly lowered his gnashing, biting mouth towards my face. The smell from his breath nearly made me sick, a rank odor of sulfur and infected wounds and fetid swamps. I couldn't fight his strength as he came within inches of my face. I tried to pull away, wrenching my neck to the side. In a blur, he snapped down, and his jaw slammed together with a sound like a pistol going off. I felt cold, searing pain where my right ear used to be. Warm blood gushed out of the wound. With a spike of adrenaline, I reached into my pocket with my left hand and grabbed my house key, screaming an insane battle cry. I brought it up to the thing's white, blind eye. The eye exploded. Something cold and squirming with maggots ran over my fingers. The creature pulled back suddenly, and I used the movement to my advantage, pushing at it with all of my strength. He fell off me, and I jumped up, my adrenaline spiking. Blood continued to soak my shirt as I ran out of the house. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I decided to drive as far as I could and never come back. But I doubted whether it would keep the abomination from returning. The winter wind whipped over the empty streets as I fled, blowing flakes of ice and snow across the dead earth. Covered in blood and shell-shocked, I listened as it howled with the cold agonies and unheard voices of the damned. Getting one of those doorbell cameras was one of the best investments I made since moving into my new house. If something happens outside your house, you catch it. I was one of those skeptics who thought it'd be useful to track package deliveries and ward off porch pirates, especially since I'm not home much because of work. But this has made me privy to little mysteries I wouldn't have figured out otherwise. Like, why was my sprinkler flooding half my yard in the morning? Well, a neighborhood kid knocked it over on his bike on a late night ride. I even got a clip of one of the local kids taking a hilarious spill on the curb outside my house, which I gladly shared around the office. But some mysteries are too much for one person, and I wrestled with a Moby Dick of problems. I got pinged with a notification of motion captured by my doorbell, and when the clip started, I saw a man waltz up to my post box. He was gleeful with his movement, a semi-pranced glide with a wide toothy grin. For him, he was a kid on Christmas, and my postbox was the toy he'd wanted all year. He reached in and pulled out one of my white envelopes, and immediately I was raging that someone was stealing my mail. Not a package which would have had value, but one of my nondescript bills. I prayed he wasn't doing this to steal my personal information, but that notion was quickly thrown out with what he did next. He slipped as much paper would fit into his mouth, bit down, and yanked sideways, ripping the letter in half, envelope and all. He chewed like he was eating A5 Wagyu beef and swallowed with glee. Then he glided away with a jovial step, eating the rest. The emotions I felt couldn't be quantified with a straightforward word. I was angry, confused, shocked, and a mix of many more swirling thoughts. Did a man really just eat one of my letters? It didn't make any sense. I was so taken aback that I didn't know how to respond. How do you report something like this? He didn't seem to rifle through the letters, looking for anything in particular. He seemingly took one at random. When I went home, I checked my mailbox, and all my usual letters were there. But as a one-off incident, I wasn't too pressed about it. Most likely, nothing of value was taken, since the only letters I received were bills or spam. So I easily chalked it down to a junkie that wandered to the nice side of town. Sadly, no matter how much I believed it was a one-off incident, it didn't make it a reality. Because it happened again. I was at work, typing away, when my phone pinged. We're allowed to check our phones while on the clock, in case it's about work. But when I saw the doorbell motion notification, I figured it wouldn't hurt to check. When I pulled up the clip, I was dismayed when I saw him again. He glided with more glee this time, down the street towards my house before stopping at my mailbox. He reached in and grabbed a couple of letters this time. He cartoonishly licked his chops like a Looney Tunes character about to eat a freshly made pie. He ate each letter differently, like a kid playing with his food. He slotted the first letter in his mouth, but he didn't rip it this time, just chewed for a while, then sucked in the rest. He nibbled bits of the second letter like a hamster before getting impatient and shoveling the rest. The third was almost like a magic trick. He tilted his head back and with a smile slotted it down slowly like a sword swallower putting on a show, and swallowed it whole. Then, with a satisfied smile, pranced off down the street. I was livid. It wasn't a big enough emergency to leave work early. I'm sure my company would choose profits over me heroically saving my junk mail, but I was seething while on shift, thinking a million miles per hour, scheming ways to stop this nonsense. When I finally got home, I tried to settle down. However, after the anger subsided, I started feeling uncomfortable. The context of the whole situation began to sink in. For a start, I no longer felt that this was a one-off incident. This man had visited twice, which only led me to think he'd come more. Also, every time I watched the footage, he never touched any of the other houses in the neighborhood, only mine. This meant he was specifically targeting me, though I couldn't think of why. I started feeling paranoid. Despite my doorbell camera not being hidden, he never seemed to look for it in any of the saved clips, which meant he wasn't hiding in any way. But if he was targeting me and wanted to be seen, what if he was doing things he didn't want to be seen? I suddenly felt very watched. Invasive thoughts of him peering through my windows flashed in my head each time I passed by one. Naturally, I closed every curtain in the house and triple-checked that all my doors were locked. But I never truly felt safe for the whole night. A few days after, I'd finished adding a few new deadbolts on my door. I even added some on the interior doors in case I needed more layers of security. My mind was rampant with scenarios of being closed in on by whatever it was that was eating my damn mail. My heart would drop whenever I got a notification about motion from my doorbell. Though it had pained me to click the pop-up, I always felt an urgency that made me need to know what was seen. Each time, it'd be someone passing by or the package deliveries for the deadbolts and various tools I needed. But with these innocuous results, the haunting feeling each time never lessened. The mail in my neighborhood doesn't come at precise times. I'm guessing I'm further into the mailman's route, so whatever the various delays he has during his shift means the time he comes varies drastically. And it was always after I'd left for work. So, when I was pinged that there was movement while on shift, I dreaded watching what was picked up. It was him again. With twirls and leaps, he light-footedly glided towards my mailbox, which contained a fresh batch of letters. He was at an all-you-can-eat buffet. It was less theatre this time, as he scarfed letter after letter, not stopping until my mailbox was empty. I was dismayed. Before, there was a chance he'd just eaten a spam letter or two and left at least some of the important ones. But this time, it was everything. I couldn't process what to do. I just closed the app and finished my day at work, hoping I'd come up with something before he came back. I ended up calling my nephew, who recommended I get the camera doorbell in the first place. To say he was confused was an understatement, and though his tone definitely let off that he didn't believe me, he gave me a piece of advice. Try talking through the camera. I didn't know this, but there was a feature that allowed me to talk to anyone outside the door via a speaker. Technology isn't one of my strong suits, so my amazement at this revelation deflected off my nephew. But to me, I was armed with the ability to try socially dissuade this visitor verbally. I savoured the moment when motion was pinged. I opened the app and saw him. He did his usual prance towards my mailbox. As soon as he opened the hatch, I clicked the mic setting and started screaming at him to stop. I was so loud that I could hear my voice reverberating back, so I knew he could definitely hear me. And hear me he did. He lifted his head and finally acknowledged the camera. He just stared for a few seconds, a smile still on his face. And somehow, he smiled more. The sides of his mouth twisted upwards in a sickening way, contrasting the emotion he was trying to portray. The jovial smile twisted to a grin that exuded malicious intent. It must have been painful to have his skin that taut. I don't think I could have achieved such a face without pulling hard with my hands or wires. However, he managed to do it naturally with no assistance. He grabbed all the letters from the box, pulled his mouth open to a gaping maw, and shoveled the whole batch in. I don't think he even chewed this time, as he consumed them all and waltzed away. Because of my outburst, I was called into the manager's office. Apparently, my expletives were heard over the phone by an important client. In my emotional high, I used some rather colourful language. My explanation probably got me in more trouble than a thinly veiled lie, because I was suspended without pay for a week. At any other time, I would have been dismayed at this. My track record at the company had been spotless for years. But as it settled in, I realized I could be home when he next visited, and I'd be able to catch him in the act. I hit up the shopping mall and picked up some goodies. I bought a metal baseball bat from a sports store to help if things got close range. I bought some pepper spray to turn a possible confrontation in my favor. I bought a slingshot with thick metal ball bearings to attack at range if needed. However, after firing a few shots at some tree branches, I realized I'd be more likely to break a neighbor's window than hit him. Watching Batman cartoons while growing up warped my perception of how easy little gadgets were to use. So I left it boxed up in the closet. Each morning, I set a chair up in the hallway of the front door. I left only one deadbolt latched, set the bat on my lap, and waited patiently. Each morning, a notification would ping, and I'd burst out, scaring the mailman each time. He must have thought I was a nut job with how paranoid I looked, but there was never a second ping, the one that tells me he's here. But when it reached the early afternoon, a time later than he'd ever arrived, I'd go out and check the mailbox, and all I'd see was an empty box, maybe a few scraps with teeth marks that were still damp. How was he doing this? Before I knew it, a week was up. I was scheduled to have a meeting at work to discuss my employment, but all I could think about was the man eating my mail. During the meeting, my phone buzzed. I slipped it out discreetly and checked the notification. Motion was detected. I didn't watch it, knowing I'd probably lose my job if I did, and my head with how red my boss was getting. But I knew what I'd see once I opened the notification. When I was finally out of the meeting, it was exactly what I thought it was. He came up, ate every letter, and left. I was at a loss. If there was a way to stop this, I didn't have a clue what it was. I just worked the rest of the day getting emails about failed payments of my various credits. I relied on monthly bills to keep track of them, and realized I'd missed a lot of important payments lately. When I got home, I walked up to my mailbox and stopped. I contemplated the whole situation, running every detail through my head over and over. Staring at the mailbox, I realized that though we had no physical interaction, this was the only thing that connected us. I slipped a piece of paper out of my coat, pulled out my pen, and wrote a simple note. Please, leave me alone. A request felt deep down in my heart, condensed to 4 words. I went home, bolted every door, and closed every curtain, trying to continue on as normal. By the time I got the notification at work the next day, I was desensitized. At home, I was still paranoid about an intruder, but watching him eat my mail each day was tiresome. But still, I decided to watch. As he finished his delectable meal, lapping it up like a hungry dog, something was different. He pulled out the note I left and gently scanned it with his eyes. Then, he looked at the camera the same way he had before, despite me not using the mic. He smiled that same unnatural smile and stared for a few beats. After an uncomfortable silence, he slipped out a letter of his own from his back waistband. The letter looked unlike any letter I'd normally receive. A contrast to the stark white or manila brown envelope, this letter was a layer of jet black paper. Its edges were trimmed in a gold leaf that shimmered through the low quality of the doorbell camera. I was enamored at this. Whatever the letter was, it was meant for me, because he slipped it into my box and slinked away. All through work, I was consumed with thoughts of this, wondering what it might be. Could it be a response to the note I left? Not likely. He had it ready, not knowing what I'd have written. This was a prearranged event. Could he have been waiting for me to leave a note, or had an arbitrary amount of time passed? This got me excited that it was a farewell, a note to tell me he was moving on. But the hope in my heart twisted with darker thoughts. Could it be an ultimatum, an offer to get him to stop but at a cost? The worst thought was that it was a threat. Could he have seen my note as a provocation, something he had ready to respond to with mental warfare? Or was it an invitation to something bigger? After all, I felt like I was being tested. My thoughts bounced around like a game of ping pong in my head until it was time to leave. And I rushed back as fast as I could, breaking a few traffic laws on the way. I turned in my drive so fast my head nearly hit the window. I rushed over to the mailbox and yanked it open, praying the letter wasn't gone or that it wasn't some manifestation of my fraying sanity. But there it was. The black was a juicier darkness than I'd anticipated, and it made the gold trimming pop, even in the mailbox's shade. I gently pulled it out, its presentation subconsciously creating a perceived value that I was respecting. There was more to it than I'd seen in the glimpses. On its face was a word so ornately written that I had to stare at it to figure out what it said. It was in that old-timey cursive you'd see in a European museum. But I worked out what it said. It was my name. I looked around. Part of me thought he was lingering nearby to watch me open it, or worse, use it as a distraction to sneak up on me. So I took a solid few minutes to scan my surroundings. I stared at trees and bushes for an uncomfortable amount of time, enough that if someone was hiding, they'd have twitched a little. But there was nothing. I was utterly alone on the street. Not even the neighbors seemed to be in. After finally satisfying my justified paranoia, I turned my attention back to the letter. Inspecting it up close did not give me any indication of what it contained. In fact, I was even more confused by what it contained. But I could no longer delay it. The time for thinking was over, and now was the time for action. I gently lifted it, scrunched it all into my mouth, and ate it. It all started when I was 16. It was Halloween, and my friends and I had all had a bit too much fun pushing each other to do something dumber and dumber. We'd snatched a bottle of red from my parents' stash and passed it around when one of us came up with the idea to check out the old mall by the freeway. The place had been closed a few years prior, and none of us had been there more than a couple of times as kids, but we figured it could make for a good story. The 5 of us crammed into a car and made our way out there, blasting music as we went along. Godsmack, POD, PM5K. It was a different time. Rod was up in the front seat, trying to smoke something, but the rest of us kept interrupting him. He had this stupid hang-up and a joke where, if you reminded him of it, he wouldn't stop laughing. It could boil down to a single word, and he'd burst. As we got there and poured out on the concrete, a chill passed through me. More so than the autumn air. The pillars outside reminded me of a ribcage, making the whole place look like a giant concrete corpse. In the dark of a Halloween night, pretty much anything can look terrifying. That's just where your mind wanders. We made our way in through a loosely boarded glass door. Stepping inside, all the light we had were our flip phones and the moon slipping in through the skylight. I'd been in that mall a handful of times over the years, but what I was seeing there and then was something different. Without the people and the ads and the billboards and the stalls, it was just a husk, something left behind. Still, we found a bunch of stuff. There were still metal racks in one of the old clothing stores which we could climb. There was a counter at the old sandwich place where we could pretend to take orders. There were windows to break, and these huge, empty spaces where our voices would carry all throughout the building. The only place that held some sort of reverence to us was the toy store on the 2nd floor. That had once been the center of our attention. We were just 16, and most of us remembered a time when we would beg our parents for a trip there. It had been the biggest toy store in our world, and there was always something new to look at. But seeing it then and there, it was just as dead as the rest of the place. Not even the sign remained. As the others made their way inside, I split off to take a walk, lighting up the hallway with my phone. They mocked me on my way, saying whoever splits off the group is always the first to die in horror movies. Hilarious. I went past what remained of the old stores, the gift shop, the flower boutique, the bookstore. I could almost see them, but only in my mind. Now, it was all concrete and cheap sandstone tiling. The place wasn't even old enough to be dusty yet, remaining in this sort of space between living and dead, like a man on life support. It'd only take the flip of the switch and this whole place would come alive, ready to welcome people back. But of course, that wouldn't happen. Then, at the end of the hall, I came to a full stop. It turns out, we weren't the first people with the idea to come here. There was a resting area in the far back, a sort of alcove. Benches set around an empty space where stalls were supposed to be, all centered around this massive red marble column. I called the others over. They had to see this. My voice easily carried all the way across the mall, and the others came running. Someone had been here. They'd flipped all the benches onto their backs and placed several pots and planters in a circle around the column. Hell, they even planted something. I could see little blue sprouts poking up. But the freakiest thing was the column itself. They'd taken the old mall posters and plastered the thing with them. These posters were just the picture of a smiling, middle-aged woman dressed in a sort of 50s attire. A generic yellow sundress with little white flowers on it. She also had the most generic stock photo smile you could imagine. To her right, on every poster, was a cartoonish speech bubble. They were just old sayings, bordering on cliches. Like Mama used to make 'em, the more the merrier, happily ever after. But the freaky thing was not the posters themselves, but what had been done to them. Someone had burned out the eyes, leaving them covered in scorch marks. With the red marble in the back, my brain sort of short-circuited, making me think I was looking into her empty sockets, seeing the gore behind the eyes. It was unsettling, and probably intentional. They also modified some of the sayings, crossing out certain words. Mama used more, ever after. It was unsettling. Some of us caught the Halloween vibe of it, thinking it fit perfectly with what we were up to. Others could sense it, like me, that this wasn't just a fun thing someone did for fun. This was deranged. It must have taken hours to arrange this sort of scene, and we couldn't imagine a good reason to do it. "That's Lady Lockley," said Rod, pointing up at the posters. "I had a crush on her. Looks like my babysitter. She's like 50, I added. "Still got a great rack." The others agreed. It was funny, but I couldn't bring myself to laugh. This felt like rot. In the same way that a corpse decays, this was the way old buildings decayed. It made me feel filthy, like I was some kind of bacteria infecting this place and breaking it down, corrupting it, digesting it. I felt sorry for Lady Lockley. She deserved better, a happily ever after. Once we got bored of wandering around, we made our way back to the entrance on the other side of the building. One of the guys squealed in delight. He'd found a ball pit. Looking at it, it was clear that this thing wasn't sanitary. We could hear something moving in it, probably rats. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a dead wire hanging like an open nerve, and the whole place was covered in a thin layer of concrete dust. "Someone's gotta go in," they said. "We ain't leaving until someone goes in." "Not me," I added. "No way." And that settled it. I was the first to decline. I had to be the first to go in, no matter if I wanted it or not. The others grabbed me and pushed me into the deep end face first. Plastic balls rattled against my ears. I was fully prepared to be drenched in rat pee and bites. But nothing happened. There was concrete dust covering my scalp and forehead, but apart from that, I was fine. It tickled my nose a bit. The pit was deep enough to reach about halfway up my body, but I'd sunken to the bottom. I could feel the rubber flooring against my cheek. The others were lighting me up with their phones. The lights coming through the balls made a sort of kaleidoscope of pastel colors, stretching the shadows out into long, distorted shapes. As I struggled to regain my balance, I fumbled around with my hands, trying instinctively to grab something. But instead, something grabbed me. It was only a silhouette, a face somewhere in the swirl of colors, the shape of a head with two holes where the eyes were supposed to be. It gasped excitedly. Even from a distance, I could taste the ammonia on its breath. Its icy fingers interlocked with mine, wanting to bring me closer. I recoiled, shaking my head. I think I let out a scream, but I don't remember doing it. My pulse shot through the roof as I forced myself back to my feet, scrambling to get back to the others. They were laughing their asses off, thinking I was just surprised. As my head breached the surface, they were standing in a half circle, shining their lights at me. Of course, there was nothing in the ball pit. I wiped my dusty hair and prepared myself to drag one or two of them down there with me. But something in the air changed. Their faces went from gleeful joy to careful curiosity to worry. Turning back towards the pit, I could see why. On the side of every ball in the pit was an eye, lovingly hand-painted with a Sharpie. The others helped me up and tried to diffuse the tension with puns and jabs. It didn't take long for the chill to leave our spines, but it took me the longest. Looking down at my hand, I felt cold, like something had really touched me, something just as real as the mall and the people who invaded it. We left shortly after, taking the car back to town, blasting our music again. We filled the rest of the night with more stolen wine, games, dares and laughs. But something in me had changed. I couldn't let go of that image of Lady Lockley and the red marble in the back of her head. Through every chuckle and every smile, that feeling held me back. Something had changed. Forever. That night, as I slept on Rod's couch, I watched the moonlight cast a shadow on the opposite wall. The cross of the window shaped the light into 4 perfect squares. As I lay there, half drunk and half asleep, I imagined them as little television screens, each showing whatever came to mind. Old memories, dreams, hopes. But every made-up show I imagined always ended the same way, with the mental image of a middle-aged 1950s housewife, a dead smile, a southern drawl, and the red, infected cavity in her skull, where her eyes ought to be. The next day, it all felt like a bad dream. Some of the guys were hungover, and most of us just made our way back home to sleep it off. I didn't want to go home. My parents were so focused on my older brother at the time that they didn't care what I did. He was the one with the problems. I could get away with pretty much anything. Being gone for a day was nothing compared to a heroin addiction. Still, I had to get back home. Much like expected, my parents weren't around. They left a note to say there were some leftovers in the fridge and that I could call them if I needed something, but that was it. I'd never once called them on that number. Making my way up to my room, I stopped. We have these 2 windows at the top of the staircase with 2 knobs in the middle. For a moment, I imagined those 2 knobs as little eyes. I could imagine them blinking. All throughout the day and the next, this would become a repeating pattern. 2 coins on the counter could send a shiver up my spine. The rings of a scissor grip would make me think of those gaping eye sockets. 2 soda cans with their pull tabs standing at attention brought me the same image. Every combination of 2 circles, spheres or rings, it all forced that image back into my head. That joyless smile of Lady Lockley and her icy fingers interlocking with mine, bringing me closer. It came to a point where people started to notice. For example, when I had dinner with my parents, they had a beer each, The bottles were placed next to one another, and the top of the bottles formed those two holes. It took me a while to notice, but when I did, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It physically made me itch, and I had this intense need to separate them. Once I did, the two of them just looked at me, not a word spoken. I tried to ignore it. I reorganized my space to make sure there was nothing around to remind me, but every now and then there'd be something. It could be something as little as two people passing on the street and their heads reminding me of floating eyeballs. But it got worse. Once, as I stepped out of the shower, I spotted myself in the mirror. Even seeing my own eyes looking back at me sent me into this spiraling anxiety. I could imagine myself eyeless, with that infected red cavity in the back of my skull. I could see it to the point where I convinced myself that it was true, that I had no eyes to begin with. My eyes would close, and I couldn't bring myself to open them. I would try to pry them open with my fingers, kneeling on the cold bathroom tiles, but it wouldn't work. Nothing would. "Come on," I'd cry. "Come on." But it just wouldn't work. It was so infuriating that it tickled the back of my brain into a joyless smile. No one else was suffering from this. I had no one to talk to, and no one would understand why I was feeling that way. It was impossible to describe. And to a group of guys who mostly talked about women and games, there wouldn't be much interest in mental health. So, I decided to do something about it myself. Much like exposure therapy, I had to go back. I was going to tear down every poster, set fire to the damn ball pit, and prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. I was going to destroy it. Lady Lockley. I was going to break those icy fingers and stare into her eyeless face unflinching. I had this crappy moped that I'd saved up for one summer. Enough time had passed for the first Minnesota snow to fall, so I had to be careful not to slip and slide. I loaded up a backpack with all kinds of destructive tools. I didn't even bother to read the note left on the kitchen counter this time. No one else was going to fix me, so I had to do it myself. I kept the wheel steady, feeling the snow slush stain my cheap jeans, cold water soaking into my second-hand shoes. By the time I got there, I was shivering. A cold wind had picked up from the overcast, and there was no moonlight to guide me this time. Still, I'd prepared. I had a great flashlight with plenty of spare batteries packed away. My dad had this battery box in the garage, full of whatever kind he might possibly need. I brought the whole thing. I made my way inside through the loosely boarded up doors. The place felt warmer, but maybe it was just me being angry. I had this frustration pent up in me, forcing me forward. I went past all the hollow shops, the broken benches, the empty planters, and the dry fountain. I climbed up the dead escalator and followed the familiar shops towards the resting area. I could see the red marble column from afar, sticking out like a sore nerve. The posters plastered to it like a band-aid to an open wound. My footsteps echoed as I made my way closer, clutching the flashlight harder. There were little sprouts in the pots and planters now, some with a little blue bud, others had barely poked through the dirt. One had grown quite tall. There were more posters now. Some had been stuck to the walls, others lay strewn about on the floor. Someone had been there recently, I could tell. A few chairs from one of the downstairs restaurants had been dragged up there and smashed, forming a kind of plastic half circle across the floor. It didn't matter to me. This was all going to burn either way. I put down my backpack and brought out a bottle of gasoline. My dad always kept a spare can in the garage, but I didn't want to bring the whole thing, so I just filled up 3 plastic bottles instead. I unscrewed the top and just started chucking it at the column, tainting the posters. They were made with some kind of plastic that didn't react well to gasoline, making part of the ink melt a little, making Lady Lockley's smile into a frown, and then a garbled mess. I went all around the column, using 2 of my 3 bottles. It was messy, and I got a whole lot of it on my clothes. I would have to wash it when I get back. My parents didn't ask a lot of questions, but if I were to come back home drenched in gasoline, they might have something to say. As I finished, I put down my bag and got a hold of a lighter. One of those with a long neck for lighting fancy candles. I tried to wipe the gasoline off my hands, but doubt was getting to me. I didn't want to set myself on fire. Then again, this place had to die. For a brief moment, I got stuck staring at the posters. Even with the ink melting off, the holes remained. Dozens of empty eye sockets staring at me, some with a barely human face attached. Some were relatively unscathed, still carrying the various slogans and sayings of Lady Lockley. There was even a fully intact happily ever after poster smiling back at me. I put away my flashlight, letting the darkness of the place overwhelm me. The overcast was doing me no favors. I held the lighter up, inched closer, and clicked it. A single light in the dark. But something was wrong. A chill worked its way across my right cheek, making me squint. Then, a breath of air. The light disappeared, and my nostrils were assaulted by the sudden smell of ammonia. And right behind me, grazing my cheek, was something cold. Something that was gently placing its fingers on my left shoulder, inching up towards my neck. I bent down, snatched up my flashlight, and turned around. The cone of light swayed back and forth, finding nothing as I backed away. My feet were stepping on their own, seemingly out of my control. My lungs felt stiff, like I couldn't push any air into them. There were puffs of smoke with every little forced, panting breath. I wasn't alone. I didn't even think about how far I backed up until my back hit the red marble pillar. I just stood there, frozen. I could feel the eyeless holes turning towards me, waiting for me to turn around. Something was running down my arm. It made its way to my fingers. I looked down, only to see fresh blood. Droplets formed at the edge of my fingertips, pooling up and dropping to the floor. The back of my head felt wet, same with the back of my pants and jacket. I carefully stepped away and turned to face the pillar. Blood. It wasn't just red marble. It was bleeding. The gasoline had made the posters slip off, falling to the floor one by one, leaving the pillar raw and unprotected. Little pools of blood ran across the floor. It was so quiet, just little tips and taps of drops hitting the floor, mixing with the echoes of my breathing. I could hear the battery in the flashlight rattling as my hand shook from the cold. And in the distance, a hiss. My ears homed in on the sound, a whisper coming from one of the nearby stores. Put them back. I just stood there, trying to comprehend what I was hearing, what it was demanding. Then, from another store from across the mall, a louder sound. Put it all back. And from a third store, an old fast food kitchen. Put me back. Looking down at the pools of gasoline and blood mixing with the misshaped plastic posters, I shook my head. I didn't want this anymore. All the anger had turned to fear, and all I wanted was to grab my stuff and leave. I'm going, I said. I won't come back. There was no response. Just like back home, there was no one to listen to me. Maybe I was speaking to an empty room, making up stories in my head. I won't come back, I repeated. This is it. Screw you all and whatever game you're playing. I won't. I suddenly choked on my breath. I could see them in the distance. Human shapes stepping out of the storefronts, all with the same cheerful yellow dress, the same hair, the same smile. Then something grabbed me. It wasn't like the first time where icy fingers daintily slipped into my hand, but something violent, angry, nails digging into my scalp, grabbing a handful of my hair, forcing me forward with a dead man's cramped grip. I went from standing to kneeling, having my face pressed onto the floor in a heartbeat. There were no more than 2 hands, maybe 4, 5. Something heavy pushed against my spine. No. It wasn't just one word. It was a choir. A dozen identical voices speaking as one from across the mall. 2 cold fingers touched my eyelids, forcing me to blink. I forced my eyes shut, trying to squint them away. I could barely breathe. I tried to move my head away, shaking the fingers off, but I couldn't. No matter how far I forced myself back, they pushed on until the pain started. This mounting pressure, causing bright, painful spots to dance across the inside of my head. It was excruciating. I was panicking, trying to turn, but I couldn't. There was this raw, primal emotion bubbling inside me, forcing me to scream. I begged and pleaded, but it was too late. I had wronged them, and they were relentless. Had it gone any further, I'd be blind today, maybe dead. But it didn't. I heard footsteps approaching and felt the fingers slowly let up. Pressure released from my spine, and the hands holding me down loosened their grip. I slowly opened my eyes, blinking away the spots of pain, only to see a man. He had a flashlight of his own, casting deep shadows on his wrinkled face. He must have been in his early 60s and was dressed in some kind of maintenance get-up. A janitor, perhaps. He walked up to me as the last hand let go and offered to help me up. I accepted it and got back on my feet. I didn't dare turn around. I could hear them, feel them, smell the ammonia. "Don't do anything stupid," he whispered. "Give them a moment." We just stood there. I looked down, trying my best not to bring any attention to myself. At the edge of my vision, I could see flowery, yellow dresses shuffle past me, back into the empty storefronts, back into the mall. He patted me on the shoulder, and I looked up. The last silhouette slipped into an old outlet space, leaving the 2 of us alone. He got some blood on his hands from touching my shoulder and wiped it off on his legs. He stepped back to pick up something he'd brought, a stack of posters and a toolbox. Walking up to me, he had this almost apologetic look on his face. "So, she picked you too, eh?" he sighed. "That makes, what, 4 of us. Using a bucket and a still working hose in the back, we got enough water and soap to clean the pillar a bit. It had stopped bleeding, coagulated in a way. We ended up putting up new posters, still with the eyes burned out. "She likes them this way," he said. "The kids always did this to the posters, long before the place closed. She thinks they're supposed to look like this." We spent some time collecting scrap and piling it into a circle around the pillar. That, and drawing eyes on various white surfaces. She doesn't have any eyes of her own, so she needs us to give her some. We spent hours just wandering around, touching up the place, watering the plants, cleaning up the gasoline. The Lady Lockleys seemed calmer. I could see them shuffling about in the back of the stores, catching a reflection of their perfect teeth every now and then. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that any threat to this place would have me swarmed. "Do you have to do this?" I asked. "Like, often?" "Yeah," he nodded. "What happens if you don't?" "I think you know what happens." At the end of the night, as I left them all behind, I saw a final, swaying flowery dress in the cracks of the wooden boards. Even now, I was being watched, judged, weighed. But for the moment, I was safe. At first, I went back like once a week. Once I brought ping pong balls and painted eyes on them. They seemed to like that. Another time, I filled up the water fountain. The janitor would return at times too, bringing freshly printed posters and scrubbing the floor. No wonder it wasn't dusty. I tried to stop going back there, but it would just build this pressure in me. I'd feel her ire. I would start to focus on circles and spheres, as if my body was reminding me that I was being watched. I'd sometimes feel something cold at the edge of my vision, something icy brushing against my ear. It would put me on edge, as if expecting something to grab me at any moment. For that damn smile to come out of the dark and become the last thing I ever see. Places like this don't get torn down. The land is dirt cheap, and the effort to break and ship off all that concrete just isn't worth it. It remains there to this day. I would go back every now and then to fix the place up, to make sure she was happy enough to leave me alone. Weeks would turn to months, and over time, they trusted me enough to come back only once every 6 months or so. I'd make a day out of it. The plants would blossom into these 6 feet tall radiant blue sunflowers, and a creeping vine would slither up the side of the marble pillar. She seemed to like the vines. Sometimes there are new people. I don't really know their names, but we can kind of recognize each other at a glance. Some young, some old. We've tried to board the place up to keep people out, but every now and then, some smartass gets through. I don't think they all make it out. Some of the things I've seen over the years tell a gruesome story of their own. I'm in my mid-30s now. I've done this for half my life as a sort of stewardship, a part of my life that I can't share with anyone. I've gotten to know her wants and needs. There is a personality there, an intelligence. Sometimes they can get these strange whims. I once saw one of them trying to break through the loose boards, only to be dragged away by the others. I've seen them gently caress the leaves of the sunflowers. I've seen them dance on tables, walk hand in hand down the empty walkways. And once, just staring up at the moon. I think she's like an immune system, like something remaining to stop the decay. This building has been closed for decades, but from looking at it, you couldn't tell. Most buildings that have been empty for that long just look weighed down and worn, but not the Deadeye Mall. It's still spry and waiting, as if expecting people to come back. And every now and then, they do. But it's a service I perform under threat of death. And to this day, it terrifies me. While I'm not as bothered by circles or rings, I still have this feeling that I should be. Like I shouldn't be normalizing this. I shouldn't have to compromise to something unnatural and otherworldly. But I just don't know what the alternative is. I have this feeling that sooner or later, she'll turn to me, dissatisfied. And that day, she'll interlock her fingers with mine and drag me to a dark place I can't come back from. Ever after. I'm an old man nowadays, and the events described within this text took place a long time ago. Still, I haven't been able to move forward. Not really. Fragmented memories pop up from time to time, images of that awful night sporadically haunting me. Seeing as I'm not long for this earth now, the Grim Reaper impatiently waiting, I figured putting it all into writing would make my last couple of months more comfortable in some way. Growing up, we had a house like any other. It was red, the pigment of the paint originating from the iron mines further up north. The corners of the casing of the windows were white. A big plot of land surrounded our home, and it included a barn constructed in the same traditional style as the main residence. Miles of pine bordered the property to the north, and fields of wheat and rye to the east. A small gravel path, no wider than an L, connected us to the outside world. If you haven't figured it out yet, we led a quaint and isolated life. But it was good. It was a good life. I apologize. I'm forgetting myself. It becomes less rare with age. I suppose you're wondering what I mean when I say we. A family of 4, plus change. That's who we were. My younger sister, Ingrid, was a gifted artist. She would start a creative journey by making dolls out of straw and drawing on the walls, much to the dismay of our parents. In many ways, her spirit was unbound by the realities of life, which I've always admired. My father was your typical farmer, seemingly always armed with a sickle. Most days, he wore a hat made out of straw and jean suspenders. So much so that some folk came to call him Kufusere, a direct translation of cowboy, with ironic undertones. He was strong-willed and cared for his family. Despite the complex relationship we had, I realized with time that he had to shoulder the burden heavier than any man should have to carry. Then, we have my mother, who was a kind and gentle woman, but she was never afraid to bring out her fierceness when haggling during intense negotiations. I remember one time at the local market when she even managed to convince our nearest neighbor that the cow we were selling had magical powers. Needless to say, we ate well that week. That may sound strange, but such was rural life back then. Fays, elves, and trolls weren't merely folklore. People gave gifts to these supposed forest dwellers and asked them to bless their crops. When the harvest turned out bountiful, they would thank the beings. When they didn't, they would ask what angered them. I reckon most of it boiled down to superstition, flawed ways of explaining the unexplained. The lone exception was that of our last couple family members. When Father spoke of them around us, he called them helpers, because that's what they were, most of the time. Whenever he thought we weren't around, when the late hour struck and darkness would creep into our house, he would quietly call them Vatar, a more fitting denomination. The word itself translates to goblin, but it doesn't feel right to call them that. Whites. They were the whites of the land. It was easy to understand as a child. In essence, they assisted us with menial tasks around the property in exchange for porridge, fruits, and pretty trinkets, which my dear sister gladly crafted. Or rather, that's the story our mother told us when we were too young to know about the darker side of the arrangement. One day, Ingrid and I found ourselves deep in the forest. Tall trees older than our country rose towards the sky from mossy beginnings. Even though the sun shone bright, its rays couldn't pierce those ancient giants. We had been playing something we came up with: helpers and herders. It was silly, as any game conjured in the mind of a child. One of us started as a cow, and the other as a helper. The cow would run buck wild due to a particularly bad case of mad cow disease. Of course, the distraught herder would be left with no other option than to seek assistance from the famous helpers. A gift to the imaginary helpers later, usually a pine cone fashioned into an animal, the cow would be cured. My sister mooed empathetically, or so I thought. "That was incredible. Do it again," I said. "I don't think that was me," she replied. Turns out, we had heard a real cow, which prompted an exploration. We moved through thick shrubbery, never minding the tiny scrapes from thorns unseen. The cow made another sound, but this time it was far closer. However, it was less of a humble moo and more of a piercing shriek. Poor thing was in pain. We huddled together on the ground and crawled into a bush. Through it, we saw the source of the sound. The cow lay blooded in the center of a circle made out of separate stones. If memory serves me right, it was 5 or 6. I won't go into much further detail about the state of the cow, but it was bad. My younger sister had never seen such brutality and let out a gasp. The gasp turned to sniffling, and sniffling turned to crying. I tried to hush her, but someone had already heard us. What followed was the berating of the century. Father had never been as angry with us as he was then. Since I was the elder sibling, most of it was directed my way. He dragged me by the arm all the way back home while muttering furious nothings. My sister walked by his side, still in shock from the grisly sight. I didn't listen to a word he said, or shouted for that matter. All I could think about was my father standing over the cow, crimson-draped sickle in hand, dancing a terrible dance. The blood and the white shimmer of the blade reminded me of our house. I never saw my father in the same way again. Later that night, when the initial emotion had simmered down, I tried asking some questions. Both of my parents were on the defensive, but I soon wore them down. Apparently, I was finally old enough to know the secret of the whites. Mother took Ingrid upstairs. Father sat me down at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering in his face. "What you saw was a sacrifice," Father said. A sacrifice? Yes, like the porridge we put on the windowsill or the dolls your sister makes. But sometimes they demand more. Why? I do not know. There are many things we don't know about them. We know that they are intrinsically linked to this land because they have lingered here longer than any man. We know that they tolerate us, even help us, because we bring them gifts. We know that they respect us as long as we respect them and the land we borrow. He went on for a while, detailing the many tenets of living with whites. You weren't supposed to disturb their paths, for example, a rule made more difficult by the fact that their roads were invisible and ever-changing. You can never deny a white a wish outright, but thankfully, they weren't very demanding usually, and it always came with the reward of a ploughed field or milked cows. As he continued explaining, I started connecting the dots. It was not possible for my aging father to run the farm all by himself. It was almost a miracle our family had prospered the way we did. Except it wasn't a miracle after all. He thanked me for listening and told me that I now was in the know, which meant more responsibility from now on. I was content with his answers and started walking up the stairs when a thought hit me. Father, what do they look like? He turned to face me quickly. His face looked almost drained of colour. The flickering of the light highlighted his wrinkles in a way that made him seem much older than he was. Go to bed, son. A while after that fateful conversation, my mother fell ill. Tuberculosis, the doctor said. The White Death. She spent much of her time in the hospital. We visited her often, bringing small trinkets for her. My sister was inconsolable, and she entered into a deep sadness, spending many a day locked away in a room. This meant that my father and I had to do most of the work around the farm by ourselves. Early mornings and late nights for months. It was taxing work, especially for a grown teenager and his elder. There were positives though. I would say I turned into a man around this time, and I got closer to my usually distant father. Also, we weren't completely alone. The whites were a godsend during this period, and much of my work focused on keeping them happy. Father eased me in, initiated me slowly. Sometimes I missed the mark, which would lead to tools or even cattle going missing. They could be mischievous, he had told me. Whenever my sins got too egregious, I would hear the pitter-patter of small feet on the roof in the dead of night, windows being opened, whispers in a language I didn't recognize from the woods, and always, just outside my field of vision, I would sense dark figures hiding. These unspoken threats felt drenched in hatred and spite, far removed from the benevolent beings my father had described. But I suspected they were capable of more than harmless pranks, and by the way my father had reacted when I asked about their appearance, he did too. Eventually, I got the hang of things. The farm ran smoothly on the shoulders of 2 men and their army of hidden benefactors. Calculations were made, and we concluded that the annual harvest would cover almost all of our expenses for 2 years. At the same time, my mother finally came home from the hospital. Ingrid was overjoyed. I never told anyone that I often snuck out at night, bringing lavish gifts to the whites. Ornate silver brooches I had stolen, golden earrings and bracelets. All of it went to the stone circle in the forest. I did not ask them for riches or a pretty girl to fall in love with. I just wanted my mother to survive. During all my trips to the sacrificial altar, I never once did see them, but they provided nonetheless. I always imagined them the way tradition had painted them for me. A small, quite chubby, happy fella with a little hat on. Then again, a sinister energy had befallen the farm despite the many good things happening. I didn't dare imagine them anymore. Our luck would soon run out. The first horror to rear its ugly head was the disappearance of Mother. It was an ordinary day. My father and I woke up at the first crow of the rooster. A fresh layer of snow covered the path to the barn yonder, which made the trek difficult and miserable. I'd recently gotten a new pair of boots, 2 layers of leather and a thick layer of wool inside, but the cold still bit my feet. Father grimaced as we struggled against wind and snow. "Today, you become a man," he said. "What do you mean?" I replied. "Do you remember the cow?" I shuddered, hopefully not noticeably. Of course I remembered the cow. Turns out, it was my turn to sacrifice a living being. At first, up until then, it was always smaller things, dead things. Now, I would have to take a life. We chose an older bull. He was sick and most likely would not last the winter either way. As far as we knew, it didn't eat them, so the disease wouldn't matter towards the quality of the gift. It made it easier, but not by much. I made my way through the forest with a leash, connected in one end to my hand and the other to Gunnar. It was a weird feeling. Gunnar had been alive longer than I. He'd seen so much, from the humble beginnings of our family to the discovery of the whites. I remember wondering if he understood what was about to happen. When I looked into his eyes, I decided that he didn't. The ritual had to be performed in a certain way. I began by tying the leash to a tree nearby the circle and started covering the bull with ox tallow. I removed a small pouch from my waist and dipped my fingers in its contents. Red ochre. I painted a kind of sign, which my father had taught me, on the forehead of Gunnar. If it was a letter, it was from a language I didn't know, or even had heard of. Not Latin, which would have been my go-to guess as far as sacrificial languages go. Not Swedish, not Sapmi. A mystery. The knife quickly moved across the throat of the bull. Before I had time to contemplate the morality of the situation, Gunnar laid in front of me. The red in the snow was too pronounced to be ochre. Blood. I had decided to perform the kill quickly, not only for Gunnar's sake, but also for the whites. The most important step of sacrificing a living thing was the dance. We had been up late many nights practicing the moves. Father had stressed the importance of doing it correctly. My movements were jerky, just as he had shown me. It felt as if I relived the moment in the bush, watching myself. The dance was reminiscent of the final few seconds of life in an animal before death came. Or sometimes it even looked like the rigor mortis after death. The dance was death in some sense, or at least closely connected to it. I breathed a sigh of relief. The deed was done. But just as I turned around to start walking home, I caught a glimpse of a figure halfway hiding behind a tree, whispers in both my ears. A headache grew in my right temple. The whites stepped out into the moonlight, and I saw them for the first time. Short, no taller than a meter. Its body was a shimmering mess of shapes that looked to be morphing constantly. The shape looked roughly humanoid, but it was clear to me I wasn't supposed to understand their form. Ferrofluid. That's what it looked like they were made out of. Opalescent, glassy, active ferrofluid. I could have mistaken it for beauty if it wasn't for the mask it wore. At the top of the shape sat a white mask with black rings surrounding the holes for the eyes. The eyes were of a pale, glowing yellow, and they observed me closely. There was a hole in the mouth as well, positioned in such a manner that it looked like it was frowning. And in the mouth were rows and rows of deathly, thin teeth. The white pointed at me, its arms starting to stretch. "Sick," it simply said, or screeched without moving its mouth. I ran home, terrified. When I finally got home, the house was in shambles. Furniture thrown around, shards of glass draping the wooden floor, planks ripped straight out from the wall. And my mother was missing. I found Ingrid, catatonic at the base of the stairs, and my father was comforting her. He gripped an axe tightly. Apparently, Ingrid had heard scratches on the door. She'd run to tell my mother, who told her to hide. She ran up to her room, crawled under the bed, and held her breath. She heard a loud noise and the sound of 20 feet tapping, a scream, and then silence. Silence for 2 minutes, she estimated. Then a maniacal cackle. The whites crept around the house looking for Ingrid. They turned every stone in the house and came an inch away from getting her too. They had entered the room she was hiding in, at least 3 making a sound as if they were trying to smell her. A long arm started feeling the underside of the bed and finally gripped my sister's foot. As luck would have it, my father had heard the screams and entered the house, swinging a torch and axe, just as the creature had found Ingrid. They scattered, some jumping out through the open windows, some seemingly disappearing into thin air. But no sign of our mother. This was new. They had never encroached on our home before. Sure, they would make their presence known through knocking on the windows and crawling around the edge of the forest. But never like this. Maybe safety was no longer. Father got sloppy after that dreadful morning. I never said anything, but deep down, I felt like he gave up. And I was angry at him for that. He still had 2 children to take care of, even though I know he blamed me for it all. I do not know what I did wrong, still to this day. We would last 6 more months on that farm. It was dark out, but not in the normal sense. Some nights are darker than others, that I now know. In hindsight, maybe it was a sign. Pack your bags now, get the hell out of these godforsaken lands. Alas, I cannot change the past. Father and I were eating a silent supper, some sort of stew with a side of potatoes. Before me sat a broken man, the marks of time chipping away at the marble. Ingrid had, after her mother's presumed death, gotten into the habit of late-night walks. Father had protested, but she was relentless. Her determination reminded me of Mom. This particular July night, she burst through the door, giving my heart some trouble with keeping up. She looked distraught, horrified, but worst of all, sad. "I disturbed the path," she simply stated. There were no questions. No, "How did you know you stepped on one of the roads if they're invisible?" No, "We'll just wait and see what happens." We all knew better than to think rationally about the Whites. If Ingrid knew she had walked over one of their roads, she had done so. Father stood up. "Get your things, only essentials. I need to release the animals from the barn. I do not want to give them anything for free," he said. That was a bad idea. He could just leave with us now. Why did he have to be so stubborn? However, there was no stopping him. Oh, how I wish I could have stopped him. He grabbed his jacket and sickle, slurped down the last of the stew in motion, and ran out of the door. Ingrid and I started packing. I helped her with what constituted essentials only, while trying to pack mine and also my father's bag simultaneously. Some clothes, a mora knife my father had given me, and one of the necklaces I'd stolen. That was it. The rest would be forever left behind. There was an invisible, ticking clock hanging in the air. The dread in the air started getting thick. You could almost touch it. Where was he? 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 25 minutes. Something had gone wrong, and I had to go help him. I asked Ingrid to start the truck. She said she knew how. Then I was off to the races. I don't think I ever had, or would ever again, run that fast. I clenched my fist around my knife and started preparing myself for what I would face. Funnily enough, I could have spent my whole youth preparing for that sight, and it wouldn't be enough. I entered the barn silently, and the barn seemed to respond with its own silence. No animals to speak of. He had managed to free them. But where was he now? I crouched and made my way through the buildings slowly. There was scattered hay and muck on the floor, but this was no time to be fancy. A weird smell emanated from the furthest corner. It was subtle at first, then stronger, and finally nauseating. Rot. Death. I turned the corner, and I almost threw up. Against the wall, 2 meters up, was my father, his torso separated from his head and limbs. All of his parts were nailed towards the wood in a Jesus-esque manner, but the cross wasn't connected. When I got a little bit closer, I saw that it was, in fact, connected by thin strips of flesh. A cowboy crucified. In my shock, I could only think about 2 things. How did the rot advance so quickly? And where were they? The answer to my second question appeared instantly. They materialized from nothing. Some were hanging on my father, digging claw-like extremities into him, or covering him in ox tallow. Some were dancing beneath. Some were staring at me with empty, yellow eyes. Tens of crystalline horrors descended upon my location in desperation. They stepped on each other, pushed each other to get to me. It was the most ancient of instincts that told me to run. So I did. They were always just a step behind. It felt like they would grab me at any second, doing God knows what with me. I imagined the sharpness of their teeth. I imagined what they hid beneath that mask. In that moment, I felt certain that if a man ever gazed upon their unmasked face, he would go mad. I barely managed to get out of the barn before one of them tackled me. It pinned me to the ground, and I slashed my knife at its body. The material of its body rapidly changed from solid to liquid form in the area I hit it. It floated in the air, not affected by gravity. Then it rematerialized as solid, attached to the white yet again. It had no effect, but it gave me a split second to slither out of its grip. I saw the headlights of our truck. I ran. "Where is he?" my sister desperately asked. "He's dead. Go." In the car, I noticed that much of what used to be my calf was missing. The whole muscle ripped almost clean off. Someone must have been looking out for me. I don't know how I possibly ran that distance in that condition otherwise. After a couple of minutes, I passed out from the pain. So there is that. I could never quite sleep well after that night. I could swear I started hearing their whispers everywhere, the sound of their feet sneaking around barely out of sight. But I never saw them again. They must have been tied to the land. Thank everything that is holy. Both Ingrid and I carved out good lives for ourselves, but we carry this with us wherever we go. I do not know who moved up there after us. I pray they're still alive. I pray they figured out the whites and what they mean. Otherwise, God rest their souls. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Being a PI sucks. It's not what you think. It's pretty much harassing women. Men hire PIs to go harass their wives and girlfriends, and once in a blue moon you get asked to find a missing dog or to harass a man instead. But that's it really. Sometimes I'm looking for hard evidence of infidelity, but a lot of the time my clients just want to rattle the soon-to-be ex, to make them paranoid and jittery and less reliable in a courtroom, or less likely to pay attention to the small print agreements that stiff them out of their holiday home. So that's my job. I'm a pawn, and it is almost always on behalf of the kind of men who think women reading a book in public are secretly looking for male attention. I don't have an office. I did for a short while, but things are tough, as I'm sure many of you know, and PI work isn't exactly lucrative. I don't know why I'm still doing this job, except to say I'm my own boss, and it's not easy out there. I went into this with vastly different expectations. If anyone wants to hire someone who's convicted of insurance fraud or training to be a police officer, let me know. Otherwise, I'm on my own, following people in cars and sleeping in dingy motels. So, when someone reached out looking for a guy to stalk them, I just figured it was a fetish thing. I got a nephew who went to art school and makes big bucks painting cartoon characters doing messed up stuff. He ain't painting the Sistine Chapel, but he pays the bills and looks after his family. I figured if that work is good enough for him, it's good enough for me. So, I met the woman and was surprised at how normal she looked. It was in a public place, a park with a nice bench, and even though it was starting to rain a little, we didn't let it bother us either. We sat there, 2 tape recorders running, and hashed it out. She said she liked me. If she hadn't, she would have gotten out of her car. That was flattering coming from her. Good-looking woman, professional. I didn't know at the time, but I quickly figured out she was a forensic accountant. Anyway, we got talking. She never gave me her motivation, but I would later come to understand her as an amateur narcissist. She was new at loving herself. She was smart, accomplished, and she was actually rather beautiful, provided we didn't spend a great deal of time agonizing over things like symmetry or eyebrows, and instead paid attention to how a smile reaches the eyes or how laughter sounds when it catches someone by surprise. But she grew up dirt poor and spent her teen years unable to visit the dentist or access a gym, or even eat home-cooked food that wasn't microwaved. Plump frame, blotchy skin, hair kept short with a pair of scissors because her and her mother relied on the shampoo and soap they stole from the motel where they shared cleaning shifts. When she fumbled awkward questions at some of the better-looking boys in her class, she rarely met with success. That's not to say she was an outcast either. She had a social life. It's just poor kids have to grow up early. Prom is a luxury, eating isn't. If you know, you know. Otherwise, you might be surprised by how tough it can be for some kids in this country. Anyway, she got out of that hole, fought tooth and nail, got an education, a good job, and by the time she finished the victory lap and took stock of her life, she was 35 years old and 1,000 miles from the trailer she was raised in. And she looked good. The woman in the mirror was a stranger that she wanted to get to know. I think hiring me was an act of self-love. I think if she could have, she would have sat in a car and watched herself get a cup of coffee, spying closely at the professional-looking woman doing a little half-run, half-skip to get out of the rain. The way she stood in line, rocking back and forth on her heels to the music in her AirPods, thinking no one would notice. She wanted to admire herself, but unable to time travel or clone herself, she instead resorted to hiring me as a kind of proxy. I had my own boundaries, of course. They covered anything that was going to get me in trouble. The gist of the contract, after a nice week spent meeting after work and talking, was that I was to follow her as often as I could and just observe her. Photos, videos, secret recordings, occasionally a little bit more. Nothing physical. For example, one time I inventoried a handbag after she left it in a taxi by accident. I'm not a photographer, but something about all those knickknacks laid out on a motel bed, snapped with black and white Polaroid. It looked good, like something you'd see in a fancy gallery. Avant-garde, as my nephew would say. She loved it, paid me a bonus for it and everything. Anyway, this carried on like this for about 6 months. There were interesting times. Tailing her across train stations, racing across open parking lots to install a tracker in her car, standing on a bridge and dropping an AirTag in her bag as she walked past. It was a little bit like being a spy. She even paid me to buy high-end equipment. Crazy stuff. One camera, I could sit on my balcony and read the texts on her phone from a block away. Occasionally, there were days where I couldn't or wouldn't keep up the required intensity. Stalking requires a lot of cardio. When that happened, and I didn't feel like following her into a crowded place or sprinting halfway around town following a car, I'd do research. I'd investigate who this woman had once been. I created fake Facebook profiles and tracked down old school friends, spoke to former teachers, lovers, all of that. The whole job was a matter of mapping her out, like she was a country, you know. And a country isn't just hills and rivers and borders. Countries have history. She was happy with my initiative. The text she sent me when I showed her the research folder was a glowing commendation. First one I'd had in a long time. It was nice. Someone telling me good job. She had a real way of making me feel like a kid getting a gold star. I didn't realize at the time, but I was putty in her hands, head over heels, bless my stupid heart. Of course, I didn't know what I was getting into, but I'd had just enough time to grow overconfident. I made the mistake of thinking that I wasn't going to find anything in her past that'd give me trouble sleeping. Boy, did I get that one damn wrong. Her mother. That's where things took an odd turn. Now, I knew from news reports the mother died in their trailer while her daughter was off staying at some boyfriend's place for a few days. Natural causes, it read. I wanted to know a little more about what natural causes there were. Figured, if there was some congenital thing, it seemed like maybe I ought to know. You'd think the way the trailer park owner reacted to me asking about it, I tried asking the Russian government for proof of a democratic election. Thin, reedy little woman who gave me hell the moment I mentioned a name. What do you want to know that for? Who's asking? Who's paying you? Why do you want to dig this up? Oh, she ripped me to pieces. I put it down to the natural sprinkling of crazies in the standard population and took a different tact. Started calling up the older folks in the park, residents. Every single one of them put the phone down on me the second I mentioned the name. Well, all of them, except one. Some people want to talk, and this old bugger was one of them. He had a lot to say about everything, from the president to social media, and I let him ramble on before starting to press my point. Told him at the start I was a historian looking into the local area. That made it so it wasn't too suspicious when I began asking about this and that. Slowly making my way to the death of a 53-year-old woman a couple trailers down from him some years ago. Again, soon as I mentioned her name, there was a change in the air, even over the phone. For a second, I thought this old guy was gonna hang up just like the others. Could hear him smacking his dry lips as he mulled it over. Francine didn't deserve what happened to her, he said after a while. She was a good woman, didn't treat the daughter too good neither, but didn't deserve what happened. Maybe if they'd found her earlier, some of those fellas in white coats could have got more evidence, put that little wretch of hers away. But from what I understand, weren't much left of her at all. Then he hung up, leaving me with a whole lot of questions. This frustrated me. I had, until now, had a fair bit of luck at this new profession of mine. They say be careful what you get good at. Sad truth was, I was getting good at stalking, and this was my first real roadblock. I remembered the way I felt when she told me good job, and it bothered me I couldn't really say much about this critical part of her life. That and, well, maybe I still got a chip on my shoulder about being a failed policeman. If you give me a problem, I can sometimes drive myself crazy looking for a fix. So I hopped in my car and drove to the trailer park, damn near on the other side of the country. Don't know what I was hoping to find. No way the trailer was still there, and it wasn't. But what I found odd was the lot hadn't been replaced. There was a hole in the ground about the right size and nothing else. Just an empty spot where the trailer had once stood, and the trailers on either side weren't occupied either. I could tell by politely and legally looking through the windows. Most of them were cleared out, but a few weren't. They still had plates and other knickknacks left hanging around, like the owners had left without bothering to pack. "You shouldn't hang around here, mister," The girl who appeared stood a good 20 feet away, shouting over the wind so as to be heard. "Smell can make you awful sick." I wrinkled my nose, aware of the odor she was talking about. Had been since I approached the empty lot. A faint, musty smell that made me think of an exotic pet shop. "What do you mean?" "Smell makes you sick." She said it like it was self-explanatory. "Woman who died there left behind an awful stench, made the neighbors sick, and the neighbors' neighbors, and so on for a couple trailers in a row. No one likes to live there now. Still can't. Had a couple move in a year or two back, and they got sick too. Daddy says it's a bad one. Not even the rats go near that hole." The smell wasn't pretty, but this trailer park looked like the kind of place where hubcaps went missing regularly. Figured they would have been used to bad smells. What made this one so special? I looked over at the girl. "Where is your dad?" A few minutes later, I was stood outside a trailer, waiting pensively. The little girl had disappeared inside to fetch her father, and since then, I'd been sat listening to the quietest trailer park in the whole world. Crickets and silence, traffic on a distant highway. Place was dying, that much was clear. When the father finally made an appearance, he said nothing for the first few minutes, lit a cigarette, offered me one. I refused on account of having quit some time back. After a while, he spoke up. "I'd invite you in, but you've been hanging around that old lot. Not sure I want you inside my home. No offense." "None taken," I replied. "Sally says you're a historian." The man wasn't terribly old, mid-30s at a guess, but he looked me up and down like I was a teenager caught throwing eggs at his house. "What are you really?" "PI," I replied. "Ha, now that makes sense. Some relative looking for answers. Heard the Hendersons had a sister with money." "That's exactly it," I lied. "She didn't buy the official story." "Nor should she," he replied. "Henderson was fit as a fiddle day he moved in. Weren't no justice in what happened to those who got sick. And poor Francine, they say she died of natural causes. Man, even back then, I knew it was nonsense, and I was just a little kid. The smell alone. Think it's bad now, but at the time, before they came in with a crane to lift the trailer up whole and move it to the dump, it was something awful. There was talk of moving the whole park. Of course, no one gave enough of a damn to give us the go-ahead and actually do it." "What did she die of?" "Don't know. Only thing I'm sure of is that girl of Francine's lied. Said her mother was live and well when she left before the weekend, and they was always on good terms, but that was nonsense. We heard 'em fighting for weeks before, for one. And of course the body. State it was in. Ain't no way it had been rotten for just a few days." He offered me another cigarette. I refused. He lit it up instead. Second one in what felt like just a few minutes. Made me itchy just to see. I wanted to say something, anything to get a little bit more. But I told a big lie pretending to be there on someone else's behalf and didn't want to catch myself out. So I just sat and listened to the quiet buzz of his little patio light. After the second cigarette was done, he reached into his back pocket and took out an old photo. "I hope you find justice for Henderson and the rest of them," he said. "Only real bit of proof I ever had of something fishy going on." He handed me the picture. It wasn't easy to see what I was looking at. Pile of old leaves maybe, mulch. I squinted at it for a good few seconds, but couldn't make heads or tails out of it. What? Took that the day they arrived to get rid of the trailer. Had to stand on my friend's shoulders just to reach. "What is it?" I asked, my skin starting to crawl as I picked out details. Whatever I was looking at, it was slumped on the sofa with floral wallpaper in the background. It was about the size of a man, but riddled with holes and cavities the size of golf balls. In my whole life, I'd never seen something that looked like that. "Why, that's Francine," he said, "or at least what was left of her." He let me keep the photo. At a guess, that was the only interesting thing that had ever happened to that man, and he'd been waiting to share it with someone. All I had to do was give him an excuse. He seemed to take some pleasure in passing it on, certainly found my reaction to be amusing. I must have gone pale as I grappled with thoughts of what had happened to make a body go bad like that. Back in the hotel, under a good light, I checked that picture again and again. Something about it made me deeply uncomfortable, knowing a woman was under all that. All those holes and crevices must have been made in her flesh, and what had happened to her skin that had turned it such a funny texture? Looked furry, like the kind of thing that grows on top of a long-forgotten cup of coffee. A part of me considered asking my client about this, but I knew that wasn't the way to go. First, she probably wouldn't tell me good job if I had to ask. She hired me to do a certain thing, and that didn't involve politely requesting information right from the source. Second, well, I'd read the police reports, what was publicly available anyway, and she'd made it clear she'd left on the Friday and came home on the Monday. And, well, what if that guy was right? Did she really leave her mother alive and well? I mean, people kill. Not just psychos. People like you and me. We do it every day, and sometimes we even pull it off. Only half of US murders get solved. That's a fact. If anyone could be the right half of that equation, it'd be her. She was smart as hell, my client. Even at 17, she would have been a clever one. Clever enough that she might easily have been able to cover her tracks, gone over to some boyfriend, twisted his arm into giving her an alibi. Sure, I could see that. I just needed to figure out what the hell was going on with that crime scene in the trailer. Thankfully, I got some friends still on the force, one of which I even have a bit of leverage on. At first, he couldn't find much on the actual mother. But then I asked him to see if he could take the photo I had, show it around, and see if anyone had seen something like it before. That proved a lot more fruitful. A few days later, he came back with a strange one, but straight away, I saw the connection. I'll spare the details. Old man was found in a tub, all sorts of messed up, in some old apartment building. It had since been condemned on account of the body, which is fairly weird since bodies don't usually cause that much fuss, but less weird when you realize that said body was in such a bad state it made 3 people sick and caused long-lasting structural damage. Whatever happened to this guy, it ate through the tub he'd been lying in and seeped into the floors and walls below, turned plasterboard to mulch, and apparently even caused some trouble for the sturdier elements like steel and concrete. I don't know how that works exactly, but that's what the file said, and going by the photos, I didn't feel like anyone was lying. As for the photos, what can I say? Made my skin crawl. No blurry little Polaroids snapped by a kid. These were professional crime scene pictures that showed something in a tub that didn't register as human until my eyes went looking for details. He looked like a hairy paper wasp's nest, only there were fingers and nipples and other little things that made it clear it had been built using a person as the framework. No face though, just a head like a pile of used paper plates. Looking at those photos made me learn a new word just to describe how I felt. Trypophobia. Wasn't just one guy either. Building was linked to the disappearance of the ground floor tenant, some computer geek. I didn't worry about him too much, but what did catch my eye was there was only one woman living in the whole place. Second floor apartment. The registered name was somewhat familiar. Close enough to a certain someone's that it raised the hairs on my neck. Police at the scene managed to get a photo of her. And sure enough, there she was. My client, going by a different name. Clearly something fishy was going on, or else why the pseudonym? I figured it possible she'd maybe offed her own mother. Parents and spouses make the most common victims. But what connection was there to that second corpse? And what about the missing guy? It was like a horror movie was following her around, and she was just blissfully unaware. Condemned buildings and festering trailers made for a far cry from the professional accountant who enjoyed oat milk lattes and used sweetener instead of sugar to spare her teeth. But there was no denying that she was connected. There was photographic proof she lived in that building. If I wanted to get ahead of this, to really understand what was going on, I had to figure out what had happened to those bodies. I'd pretty much exhausted my favors with the police, and truth was, they didn't know any more than I did. But it turned out the building was still standing, condemned, but they hadn't demolished it, partly because no one wanted to take responsibility. But I reckon it might have had something to do with the biohazard warnings slapped on every single window and door. Good thing I brought a gas mask. I waited for sunset, geared up, and entered through the unlocked door. First thing that hit me as the door swung open was the smell. Similar to the trailer park, but full pelt and hot as well. Made me think of lizards and poorly kept terrariums, strong enough to make my eyes water even through the mask. One thing was clear as I took a look around the hallway. The building was diseased. Not just run down or decrepit like the usual urban decay. This was something else. Looked like the inside of a clogged pipe. You know how limescale fills it up? It was a bit like that. This oily, rusty-coloured fluid had seeped down the walls and left them glistening and soft. Ropey stalactites of the stuff hung down from the ceiling like old party banners, and I edged around them, afraid of what might happen if one touched me. Best guess was that stuff was digesting the place. Anything soft or organic was going or gone. Old umbrella frames were left standing in one corner, the fabric burnt or dissolved away. The carpet was reduced to just a few patches no bigger than my hand, and a bunch of old cardboard boxes piled up under the stairs had turned squat and half liquid, almost flowing down and around each other. The worst came when I took a look around the back room. More of a broom closet, I guess. Wouldn't have gone in, but something caught my eye. A well-worn shoe that wasn't covered in oily stuff. Sign of recent activity. That, and the way the door was ajar, just raised my suspicions. So, I took a look. Even now, the timeline eludes me, but someone, a vagrant most likely, given the way they were dressed, died a nasty death in there. Chemical burns come to mind. They were balled up in one corner, eyeless, looking up at me as I pushed the door open to take a closer look. Pink flesh threaded with red blood vessels, yellow bones poking through here and there. From the looks of things, they'd been trying to work the door open. You could see a history of their escape attempts left by bleeding hands. Rust-colored finger streaks ran all along the door's edges, special attention paid to the hinges. And he'd broken the only window and tried hauling himself up there, only to realize it was barred from the other side. The jagged glass that still clung to the frame was covered in old blood. His palms must have looked like grated cheese. Eventually, he'd given up and laid down in that mess, and the thought of it made my chest feel heavy and tight. I'd only been in the building a few minutes, and that stuff was already eating through my shoes. I could hear the thick rubber soles sizzle and pop with each step. But that guy had been forced to sit down in an inch-deep puddle of the stuff, likely because exhaustion had left him no choice but to tough it out. So how long had he tried to stay upright? Hours, days, weeks. Him getting stuck in there had to be deliberate. I was sure of it. A feeling in my gut. Someone had locked the door behind him and left him to die slowly. God only knows why. But did that mean they were still hanging around and waiting for a chance to get to me? Looking around, I sure didn't feel safe or alone. The shadows seemed too deep, and the steady drip, drip, drip of that rancid oil oozing out of every surface was too monotonous. Someone or something lived in that filth, and chances were they'd been responsible for that poor vagrant's agonizing death. That meant getting out of that hellhole was a priority. So I made for the stairs and started to climb. If there were any answers in that place, it had been the apartment where the old man died. The crime scene tape was still hanging off the doorframe when I found it, and the TV and sofa, or what remained of them, stood in the same place as in the photos. Back in the day, the old man had been a hoarder, and I was surprised crime scene hadn't cleared all that stuff out. It was all still there. Only what had once been a chest-high maze of papers and magazines was now just kind of hardened pulp, almost like magma dried mid-flow. The whole damn place was covered in the stuff, like coral reef, growing up the walls and even patches of the ceiling. Looked a hell of a lot like a wasp's nest, and it looked to be the source of that oily-looking fluid. You could see it sweating out of every crease and fold in that strange hive. It was almost hypnotic to look at. Glistening amber beads oozing out of papery sheets that flowed like rock strata. There was a gentle, barely perceptible rhythm. Hypnotic. I don't know why, but I reached out and ran the tip of my finger as gently as I could along the surface. It felt like the underside of a mushroom. All those papery gills, gossamer thin, soft and inviting. I wore no gloves, and the brief moment of contact had deposited a single bead of that strange syrup on my fingertip. It caused a tingling sensation that was not entirely unpleasant. Even the blood that trickled down my knuckle felt warm and wet, like testing a hot bath with your hand. I liked it, and I wanted more. I went to reach out and push my arm into the nest when a hand burst out of the nest and gripped my wrist. I was so surprised I didn't even make a noise, but instead wordlessly fell back as the hand pushed me away from the nest. A nearly skinless forearm followed, and soon after, a face emerged from the papery nest like a grime-covered nightmare. Black eyes and a lipless mouth. It was a man that could have passed for a corpse, like a half-digested piece of meat. Terrified, I struggled to my feet and realized that this person and broken damn near every bone in my wrist with that single grip. "Your meat smells raw," he growled before heaving himself out of the nest in a disgusting parody of childbirth. My sanity flickered, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground floor with bleeding eyes and both hands frantically pulling at the door handle. My mind returned in pieces. I blinked red tears away, but didn't stop trying to open the door. I felt it, that urgent need to leave, like a suffocating man feels the need to breathe. But I'd messed up bad. I'd sniffed out of the closet and saw the trap laid there, but hadn't seen the larger one set for me. There was only one way in and out of that building, and I hadn't jammed the door open. Now it was shut, and nothing I did could get it open. With more time, maybe I could have pried the jamb or even kicked it down, but my heart was racing and my vision was blurring. I wanted out of that place, a hot primal need to get the hell out. The air was too hot, my mask too stifling, sweat condensed on the inner plastic and made it damn near impossible to see. And the pain in my wrist was a throbbing explosion that made sensible thought impossible. I'd realized early on into my little fray that I was underprepared, but the scale of what that meant eluded me until I was there, wrestling with thoughts of exposure and contagion and disease, fumbling at a greasy doorknob with a broken hand while suppressing thoughts of what might be crawling up my leg or back or neck. Panic threatened to consume me. The world and all the normality it represented was right down there. I could hear it. The distant hum of traffic, the amber glow of streetlights that lit up the biohazard posters. Not 30 minutes ago I'd been there, safe and far away from this waking nightmare. I was being reduced to a prey animal. Even in the moment I could sense it happening to me, being made into something lesser. But it was like my actions were no longer my own. When I finally gave up on that front door, I turned around and saw the shadows way back at the hallway begin to shift as something descended the stairwell. There was no other way out, no door, no window, just me, a long corridor, and a nightmare coming right at me. Something inside me gave up. I don't know how to describe it. I'm still not sure if it was that building and that strange fluid that seemed to warp my own thoughts, or maybe there's just too much one person can go through, but I could practically hear the thin membrane of my sanity tear as I fell backwards into the door and slid down, breathlessly awaiting my terrible fate. I almost contemplated turning off my light, but by then it was too late. I could see him coming towards me. He was legless, nothing from the waist down except blackened viscera trailing up the stairs behind him. He pulled himself towards, hand over hand, with hungry eyes. Before I knew it, he was on top of me, one hand gripping my mouth with a salty palm, the other stroking my hair. And then, in an instant, his demeanor changed. He pulled back with a terrified cry and scrambled away like I'd just struck him with a blade. "No, no, 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 no," he muttered. "No, no, you should have said, I didn't know. I thought you were another one. I didn't know, I thought you were here for me. I didn't know you were hers." He cowered away, pedaling on both hands backwards while keeping his eyes fixed on me. "Tell her I did not know you were hers. I could not smell until I was close, very close. If I hurt you, I am sorry. Tell her I am sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. It is just, I do not get to eat often, and I'm always hungry." With a rapid gesture, he threw the key for the door at me. It skittered across the floor and fell just short of my feet. "Tell her I did not know." "What are you?" I stammered. He looked at me, curiously, stopping his retreat only briefly to gauge my expression. She likes to be seen, but I looked without asking, and I got what I deserve. Who are you talking about? I asked. He very nearly laughed, but with such deformities, it was mostly a drooling guffaw. You know, he gasped. Don't be stupid. You're in love with her, just like me, but different. You got permission. I didn't. But she was good. She left me an old nest to live in, and I have permission to eat anything I kill or trap myself. Hard now that people know to stay away, but sometimes I get lucky. His eyes flicked to the closet with sickening hunger. What has this got to do with her? I asked. What colour are her eyes? He replied, almost manic with excitement. Answer, tell me, what colour are her eyes? I stopped. The word felt wrong in my mouth. Blue. No, he chittered. None of those. Seemingly excited but afraid, he raced forward momentarily and gripped my lapels with twisted glee. Compound, he hissed with such forbidden pleasure. Her eyes are compound. She's jealous of us, you know. Jealous we get to love her. And then he disappeared into the darkness, and something inside me gave way entirely, and I passed out. I don't know much of what came after exactly. I was found a few hours later in my car, idling at a traffic light. I'd made some effort at getting away on my own, but didn't get very far. No surprise here, but I got sick as a dog going in that place. A deep chest infection, the kind that scares everyone at least once in their life. Only fair, given how stupid I was. But forgive me, I hadn't anticipated nightmares beyond human comprehension. I challenge anybody to think that far ahead. You think junkies, you think flies, squatters. But that guy, that man slipping out of the nest and barreling towards me on two hands, my mind going sizzle pop along with the soles of my boots. In real life, things like that always sneak up on you. So I paid the price. 6 months. Jeez, 6 long months. I got every fever you can think of. Sepsis, kidney failure, liver failure. Month after month drowning in my own fluids, coughing up stuff that made the nurses gag and leave. I asked the doctor what the long-term effects will be, and he winced before reading a list of things that didn't leave much hope for a happy retirement. And if it was hard on my body, it was even worse on my mind. Those fever dreams. Doctors say what I remember in that building, that was all just part of the sickness. Say I spent a good 3 days in a coma and strange dreams are the norm, which I might accept if it weren't the damn skin graft still healing in my right hand. No one can explain that. My client visited, just the once. There are universally sad moments in life, and one of them is realizing someone you have a lot of affection for doesn't have it back. They have some, just not the same amount. It was always one way though, wasn't it? I saw her every single day, but if I was doing my job right, she only saw me once a month for our meetings. Our arrangement ended not long after, so I hope anyway. She left me like it was nothing. But me? Jeez. It felt like someone excavated my heart right out. Even after what she told me why she was there, even after what I did, I could barely stand up straight. I was so heartbroken. There were times after that I wish this sickness would just take me. Maybe that defeatism is why it got so bad. Who knows? She came to me looking for a recommendation of all things. She wasn't cold, far from it, but there was a sense of disappointment as she sat beside me and eyed me up. "I liked the initiative," she said after a while, "but the results leave me unimpressed." "What the hell happened in that place?" I asked, and even though I could barely hear my own voice, she seemed like she heard every word. For a moment, the way she contemplated it, I thought I was going to get a straight answer. "You know, my mother said men don't see ugly women. They know they exist, but they just poof them right out of their mind, like a magic trick. She said we worked better being a little plain, good enough to take home for a night, anymore, and we'd start to leave problems everywhere we go. That guy was a problem. She was trying to warn me about the dangers of attention, but silly me, I went and got addicted. I hoped with you there might be a degree of separation, infatuation on a contractual basis." She took a deep breath, like she'd had a long, hard day. "I don't know. Maybe Mum was right. It's ridiculous, I suppose. The fly shouldn't admire the spider. It either sees it and fears it, or doesn't know what's coming until it's too late. I think Mom was telling me to go for the latter. It's no fun being invisible, though. You spent all that time looking at me, following me. What did you see?" I looked at her until my eyes watered and something throbbed in my skull. "I don't know," I tried to lie. "Be honest." She looked right at me, and something in the air changed. I don't know what. Hot. Jeez, it was hot, like looking at the sun. I remember the heart rate monitor going nuts, and then I remember gossamer wings and serrated chitin, a tick on the side of your cheek, a leech on your tongue, a horsehair worm that won't leave the skin. And then an instant later, my eyes refocused, and there was just a normal woman in front of me. "Someone I could have loved," I answered, unable to stop the words spilling like vomit. "Someone who I thought deserved love." "See," she said, "who wouldn't like your version better?" I was crying again, heart racing, whirled like butter, going soft at the edges. Whatever she did, it was like undergoing brain surgery in real time. "I'd like a recommendation," she said after another minute or two of silence. "I'd like to see myself. I look in the mirror and I don't see what you do. I'd like an artist to paint me, a version of me at least. It won't be easy on them. All this time you've probably looked directly at me for no more than 5-10 minutes in total. Just didn't realize it. Always the back of my head or my hair obscuring just so. That won't do. I want a portrait. I want to know what you see." "What will you do then?" "I won't do anything. Not intentionally. But if you ask someone to paint the sun, expect them to go blind. Whoever paints me will be painting the sun in their living room. Going blind is the least of their problems. Now, fess up. You know someone. You mentioned them once in passing. A cousin maybe. An artist in need of cash, I'm sure of it." "Why would I tell you anything?" "Because you love me," she said. "And because despite everything, you will get better, and you will come back to me. Year or two, I think. You are adamant I have no hold on you, and you will think that for a long time. In this period of freedom, you'll enjoy it only by my good grace and mercy. You did a good job, better than anyone before. I've read your notes and reports over and over, and seen details of myself I didn't even know were there. It's a thing of beauty, what you did, and one day soon you'll come back to me with some excuse for why you want the contract to continue. I tried to spit the word never, but managed, at best, a weak shake of the head, something that put a most peculiar smile on her face. It doesn't work like that. It'd be like trying to brute force your way through Alzheimer's. You'll be back. Even now you're mine. All mine. I'm just being gentle. And you're going to give me the name and number of that artist because even though you know I could no more love you than a spider loves the fly, you are desperate to please me. Because when I broke the man in that apartment building, when I tore him in two and told him that he would live there for as long as I desired, writhing without air for years and years, drowning in sickly fluid and trapped helplessly in a hive, he's determined to maintain, even though I wouldn't be caught dead going back there. He was grateful, and with time, you'll be grateful too. She put a pen in my hand. She smiled, mouthed the word, "Good boy." And God help me, I gave her my nephew's number.